Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The wind whispered low through the trees, a murmur of ancient secrets that made the air feel thicker, heavier than usual. Luke paused, his breath visible in the chill morning air, and let his eyes roam over the vast expanse of the Lolo National Forest. The towering pines stretched upward like ancient sentinels, their gnarled limbs shaking in an unseen breeze. He was miles deep into this wilderness now, miles away from the nearest road, surrounded only by the silence and shadow of the woods. A sense of solitude wrapped around him like a cloak, familiar and comforting, until it wasn't. He had always come to the forest to hunt, to get away from the world. But this time, something felt off. Perhaps it was the creeping sense of unease that had followed him for days, the feeling that the forest itself was watching him, waiting for something. He shook off the thought, chalking it up to the isolation of the deep woods, his mind playing tricks on him. Luke was used to the wild. He had spent years hunting here, tracking deer through the fog-saturated mornings, listening to the eerie calls of wolves in the distance. It was his sanctuary, the place where the world's weight slipped away and only survival remained. But today, there was no escaping the nagging sensation that something was wrong. As he moved deeper into the heart of the forest, the landscape began to change. The once thick trees gave way to a patch of clearing, unnaturally round, as though it had been carved out by an unseen hand. In the center of this clearing stood a hunting blind, but not one he recognized. Its structure was half crumbled, the wood weathered by years of neglect. The paint had chipped away long ago, and vines crept up its sides like a slow-moving infection. It was almost as if time had forgotten this place, or perhaps as though it had been abandoned deliberately. Luke's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his back, and he took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching through the dry underbrush. The wind stilled as if holding its breath. The woods around him felt unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves muffled as if by some unseen force. The world seemed to pause in that moment, and a cold shiver crawled up his spine. "Hello?" His voice sounded small and strange, swallowed by the emptiness. There was no response, but the silence itself seemed to answer him, pressing in from all sides. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Why would anyone leave a hunting blind out here, in the middle of nowhere? His heart began to beat faster, a familiar rush of adrenaline flooding his system. Luke's instincts told him to turn around and leave, to retreat to the safety of the woods he knew, but he ignored them. His curiosity, sharper than any hunting knife, urged him onward. He approached the blind cautiously, every step calculated. The structure creaked under the weight of years, and as he reached for the door, the faintest smell of mildew and decay drifted toward him. The door groaned in protest, swinging open with a sound that seemed far too loud for the stillness around him. Inside, the air was thick with dust and neglect. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the decaying wood, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the floor like specters. Empty bullet casings were scattered haphazardly, dull metal glinting in the dim light. A torn, weather-beaten backpack lay abandoned in the corner, its straps frayed, its contents long since scattered or consumed by the elements. A half-empty water bottle lay on its side, forgotten. Luke stepped inside, feeling an odd tug at his chest as the door clicked shut behind him. The familiar scent of pine and earth from the outside was gone, replaced by the stale, musty air of the blind's confinement. His boots crunched on the debris beneath him as he took in the desolate interior. He scanned the walls, eyes narrowing, as they landed on something unusual, a Polaroid photo, wedged between two wooden slats in the corner of the blind. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for it, the plastic film cold against his fingers. It was faded, curling at the edges, but still mostly intact. He held it up, squinting to make sense of the image. The photo showed a man who must have once been the occupant of this blind, sitting with a look of abject terror on his face. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open as if frozen in a silent scream. His clothes were torn, and his face looked gaunt, hollow. But it was his eyes that unsettled Luke the most. Those wide, empty eyes seemed to stare through him as though they were trying to tell him something. Something urgent. A strange chill coursed through his veins as he held the photo in his hands. The man in the photo looked like he had seen something beyond human comprehension, something that had driven him to the brink of madness. Luke's breath came faster now, his pulse quickening. He had never been one to believe in superstitions, but this was something different. There was something about the blind, something wrong, something that went beyond the simple decay of time. As he turned the photo over, a shudder ran through his body. Carved crudely into the back of the wooden frame was a message. It only moves when you look away. The words seemed to thrum with an eerie resonance, as if they were meant specifically for him, meant to be read at this very moment. Luke stepped back, the breath caught in his throat. He wanted to leave. He should leave, but his legs felt rooted to the floor, unwilling to obey the command to turn around, to retreat. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the words echoed in his mind. It only moves when you look away. He lifted his gaze from the message, staring out the narrow window of the blind. His eyes scanned the surrounding forest, searching the shadows, waiting for something to shift, for something to... A loud crack split the silence. Luke's body jerked as the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping reached his ears. It came from just outside the blind. His head whipped toward the door, but there was nothing, only the dense forest stretching out in all directions. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something lurking just beyond his line of sight, waiting. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. The air felt thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. His mind raced, the panic rising in his chest like a tide. He needed to leave. He turned toward the door. Then he froze. Fresh footprints, large and heavy, were visible in the dirt just outside the door. They were so recent, the edges still sharp, as though the person who made them had just passed through moments before. And those footprints, they led straight toward the blind. A sudden rush of adrenaline surged through Luke's veins. His heart thudded in his ears as he backed away from the door, eyes darting around the blind. Something was out there. Something was watching him, and it was getting closer. The wind shifted. A low hiss through the trees that seemed to carry whispers. Faint, unintelligible voices that scraped at Luke's sanity. He stood frozen in the middle of the blind, staring out at the clearing where the fresh footprints led toward him. The breath in his chest felt tight, constricted, as though the very air around him was compressing, unwilling to let him go. The sudden realization hit him like a slap in the face. He was not alone. He glanced toward the door again, the cold wooden frame almost seeming to loom over him now. It had creaked when it opened, a slow, drawn-out sound that hadn't been heard in years. The darkness outside had become something more oppressive, its shadows lengthening like claws reaching for him. He swallowed, but the dryness in his throat made it nearly impossible. His legs, stiff with dread, refused to move, and for a moment He considered the absurd notion that if he stood still long enough, maybe whatever was out there wouldn't notice him. But the footprints, those unmistakable large tracks, were still fresh. They were still here, still so close. His fingers gripped the photo tighter, crinkling the corners of the Polaroid. But the sight of the man's terrified face wouldn't leave him. It haunted him, every detail seeming to pulse with a hidden warning. Something had happened here, something terrible, and now, somehow, it seemed like it was happening again. The thought raced through Luke's mind like a speeding train. Maybe it wasn't the man in the photo who had left the footprints. Maybe it was someone or something else. His pulse quickened. The message carved into the wood echoed again in his mind. It only moves when you look away. The words pressed down on him like a physical weight, suffocating him. He didn't understand what they meant. Didn't understand why they felt like a warning specifically for him. The smell of old wood and mildew filled his nostrils, but underneath that, there was something else, something foul, like rotting flesh. His gut twisted. There was a shift in the atmosphere, something subtle, something that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The kind of change that didn't announce itself, but crept up on you, invisible and insidious. Luke's instincts screamed at him to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible, but the blind had him trapped. The door was the only way out, and the presence outside, the weight of something close, watching, kept him from moving. Suddenly, the whispering wind outside seemed to pick up again, louder this time. It swirled around the blind in erratic gusts, a low groan of the trees bending under the pressure. But there was something else, something wrong. The forest wasn't moving how it should. The branches didn't sway as if caught in a breeze. Instead, they twisted, and with each twist, the trees seemed to lean closer, angling in on the blind, as if they were slowly closing in around him. A chill swept down his spine, the temperature inside the blind plummeting. It wasn't just cold, it was a biting cold, like ice scraping against his bones. Luke shuddered. What the hell is going on? His hands trembled as he took a slow, deliberate step toward the door, his eyes flicking between the dark outside and the interior of the blind. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, as though they were pooling, gathering strength. The dirt outside was still undisturbed, save for those eerie footprints. He stepped cautiously closer to the door, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. His hand hovered over the handle, the sudden weight of the moment nearly unbearable. As he prepared to push it open, he paused, the weight of the photograph still in his hand. The man's eyes, the terror in them, felt like they were pulling at him, like they were watching him. It was as though they were warning him, urging him to leave, to get away before it was too late. But was it too late? He could feel his pulse in his throat as his fingers curled around the door handle, pushing down just slightly. The wood creaked in protest again, the sound sharp and jarring against the silence. His breathing quickened. He didn't want to open the door. But if he didn't, what would happen? As his hand twisted the handle, a sudden crack rang out from the trees behind him. It wasn't a branch this time. It was a footstep, a heavy footstep, as if someone, was pacing just outside, just beyond his sight. Luke's heart stopped. There was no breeze now, no whispering wind. The forest was utterly still, too still. A shadow darted past the blind's small window, too quick for him to catch any real details. But in that split second, Luke's breath caught in his chest, his body frozen with the sharp instinctual awareness that something was out there. Something big. Something waiting. His hands shook as he let go of the door handle and backed into the center of the blind. His mind raced, a frantic whirl of thoughts colliding in his skull. What if it saw me? What if it's waiting for me to make the first move? The air grew heavier, and the faintest of sounds, a scrape, came from the corner, as though something in the blind had shifted. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Luke's gaze flickered to the torn backpack, lying forgotten in the corner, its contents still spilling out from the broken zipper. A piece of cloth caught his eye, a dirty, torn piece of a jacket, but that wasn't what held his attention. The edges of the cloth were covered in something dark, something that glistened in the dim light like fresh blood. He took an involuntary step toward the backpack, his hand shaking uncontrollably. As he knelt to examine it, his mind raced with questions. Had the previous occupant been hurt? Or had they left in a hurry, leaving all of their belongings behind? What happened to them? He reached for the torn fabric, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cloth. The bloodstains were deep and dark, far too fresh to be weeks or months old. Another sound, closer this time. A soft, labored breath. Luke whipped around. Nothing. The forest beyond the blind remained still, untouched. But the unmistakable sensation of eyes on him pressed into his skin, sending a wave of terror so sharp it made his stomach flip. His instincts were screaming now. He wasn't alone. Whatever was out there had been here long before him. It was watching him. It had always been watching him. And then, before he could process what had happened, his gaze flicked back toward the door. The footprints were no longer just outside. They were inside the blind. A trail of heavy, dirt-encrusted prints leading from the door to where he stood. Something was moving closer. The silence that followed the discovery of the footprints felt suffocating, like a blanket wrapping tightly around Luke's chest, squeezing the breath from him. His heart hammered against his ribs as his eyes scanned the interior of the blind. Once more, the footprints were no longer just in the dirt outside. They had crossed the threshold, leaving deep impressions on the rotting wood floor beneath him. He could feel his mind unraveling piece by piece as his eyes tracked the trail. The footprints, large and heavy, were like a mocking reminder that he was not alone. Something had been here, had crossed the very space he now occupied. They led toward him, and he knew, without a doubt, that they hadn't been made by the previous occupant. Whoever had left those prints, whatever had left them, was still here, still watching. Luke's breath was shallow, his body rigid as he tried to make sense of it all. The photo, the blood-stained backpack, the terrifying message carved into the wall. And now, these footprints. It only moves when you look away. The words echoed through his mind, hammering against the rising tide of panic, threatening to overwhelm him. He felt like a rat caught in a trap, every escape route blocked, every corner of the blind seeming to close in on him. The oppressive air grew heavier, thickening like a storm cloud pressing down on him, suffocating him. His legs, though stiff with fear, moved on their own accord. Step by tentative step, he backed away from the center of the blind, his eyes never leaving the footprints. They had come too close to him for comfort. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he reached out instinctively, his hand brushing the edge of the torn backpack once more. He didn't want to touch it, but his fingers moved as if they had a mind of their own. The fabric of the bag crinkled under his touch. He pulled it closer, feeling the weight of it in his hands, the cold, damp fabric sending a tremor through his body. There was something wrong with it. The smell of decay lingered in the air around it, mingling with the scent of mildew and rotting wood. He held his breath, afraid that if he breathed too deeply, he would choke on the stench of something far worse than just old leather and torn fabric. As he rifled through the bag, his hand brushed against something hard and metallic. His pulse quickened. What was that? With trembling fingers, Luke pulled the object out. A small hunting knife, its blade covered in dried blood. His stomach lurched as he realized the blood was still fresh. It had to be. It wasn't the kind of blood that dried to a dark, brownish color. No, this was a deep crimson red, new blood. The knife was still coated in it. His mind screamed for him to throw the knife down, to rid himself of it, to stop touching it. But something kept him rooted in place, staring at the blade, mesmerized by the way the blood still clung to it like a macabre reflection of what had happened here. What had happened here? His mind flashed back to the Polaroid, to the man with hollow, terrified eyes. The terror in that photograph hadn't been a momentary thing. It was a lifetime etched into his features, a look of someone who had lived through something that had cracked him to his core, someone who had come to this very blind, had stayed here, and had never left. Luke's fingers clenched around the hilt of the knife. He didn't know why he was still holding it. He couldn't explain the pull it had on him. It felt wrong, so wrong, but he couldn't stop. Something about it felt like it was calling him, begging him to understand the story it had to tell. A sudden gust of wind ripped through the blind, making the wood groan and the walls shake. Luke jumped, the knife slipping from his fingers and clattering across the floor, its sharp sound piercing the stillness like a scream. The wind howled louder now, filling the space with a faint but distinct sound, a whispering like voices carried on the breeze. He couldn't make out the words, but they were there, just on the edge of his hearing, just enough to send chills crawling up his spine. His body tensed, the knife forgotten on the floor as he whipped his head around, scanning the corners of the blind. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, more urgent, as though it was coming from somewhere inside the walls, from the very earth beneath him. It didn't seem to be from outside, where the wind should have been. No, this sound was inside the blind. It was close. It was inside his head. Luke's heart pounded as his hand shot up to his ears, pressing against them, as if he could block out the whispers. But it was no use. They seeped in, winding their way around his mind, coiling like snakes. The whispers grew darker, as if the forest itself was trying to communicate with him, trying to tell him something he wasn't meant to know. Suddenly, he felt it. The presence. It wasn't just the whispers now. It was the weight, the heaviness that settled on his chest, on his very soul. The sensation that he was being watched, but not by something human, not by anything with eyes like his. No, this was different. This was something ancient, something otherworldly, something hungry. His head snapped toward the window. The trees outside had twisted even more, their branches clawing and creaking in unnatural angles, as if they were pulling themselves toward the blind, toward him. The darkening shadows in the forest pressed in closer, the line between the blind and the woods blurring in the dimming light. And then, a snap. It wasn't a branch breaking this time. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something inside the blind, something behind him, just out of sight. A shift, a creak, like the very walls themselves were breathing, groaning, under some unseen weight. Luke's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced with panic, with confusion. Should he look? Should he turn around? His feet felt frozen, cemented to the floor, but his body screamed at him to move. He knew what he had to do, the words carved into the wall. It only moves when you look away. Suddenly made sense. A sickening, visceral understanding shot through him. Whatever it was, whatever had followed him into this blind, it was waiting for him to look away. To turn his attention for just a second, Luke's body screamed for him to run. His mind screamed for him to stay still, to do the one thing that would keep him safe. Keep his eyes on the shadows, on the moving, twisting limbs outside. But the whispers were growing louder, pulling him in. His gaze, despite all his willpower, began to drift, and then a movement out of the corner of his eye. The The movement was subtle at first, a mere flicker at the edge of his vision, so faint that Luke might have convinced himself it was a trick of the light, the sway of the trees, the shifting shadows that danced with the dying daylight. But he knew deep in his gut that it wasn't just his imagination. Something was there. Something had moved. His breath hitched. The whispers were louder now, an indecipherable cacophony that crawled under his skin, burrowing into the folds of his brain. His hand trembled as it reached for the door, but his fingers faltered inches from the knob, frozen by an invisible force, paralyzed by the weight of dread that seemed to press down on him from all sides. He knew it was waiting. It had been waiting for him to look away, and now that he had, there was no going back. The wind outside moaned, a low, eerie sound that made the walls of the blind creak like bones in the cold. But it wasn't the wind that made Luke's heart race. It was the sound that followed it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, dragging across the dirt outside the blind. The sound grew louder with each passing second, the thuds reverberating through the earth and into Luke's bones. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, was coming closer. Luke's eyes darted around the blind, frantic and wide. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, like dark fingers creeping toward him, as though the forest itself were inching its way inside. He could feel the presence now, unmistakable. Something was standing right outside the door, just beyond the threshold. He could feel it in his chest, a cold, suffocating weight. It was watching him. The fear hit him like a punch to the gut, a raw, primal terror that clawed its way up his throat, making it hard to breathe. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to take a slow, steady breath. But the air was thick, heavy with the stench of decay. The very ground beneath him felt unstable, like the forest floor was shifting, bending to the will of something ancient. His body screamed for him to run, to escape, but the door, the only way out, was not an option. He couldn't leave. Not yet. Then, the whispering stopped. For a single, terrifying moment, the world went still. The sounds of the forest disappeared, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. The weight of silence pressed down on him like a thick fog, so thick it almost felt tangible, as if the air itself had solidified around him. It was then that Luke felt it. A shift, a change, something moving just out of sight, like a shift in the shadows, a ripple in the fabric of reality itself. The walls of the blind seemed to breathe, groaning as if the very building were alive, a part of the forest's twisted, malevolent pulse. The dirt beneath his boots shifted, groaning as though something beneath the earth was stirring. And then, the eyes. He saw them. Two pale, glowing orbs just beyond the thin, weathered glass of the window. They glimmered in the dark, like the moonlight itself had taken form, distant and cold. But as they focused on him, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. A slow, dreadful realization settled in his chest. These weren't just eyes. They weren't human. They weren't even of this world. The things outside the window moved, the shadows of the forest bending and swaying unnaturally, as if the trees themselves had taken shape. The footsteps grew louder now, not the normal rhythmic sound of someone walking through the forest, but a heavy dragging, like the earth itself was being torn apart. Something, or someone, was struggling to move through the dirt, scraping, dragging, pulling itself closer with each agonizing moment. Luke's breath caught in his throat, panic flooding his veins. His heart was racing and his palms were slick with cold sweat. He had to move. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit there and wait for it to come for him, to claim him like it had claimed the man in the photograph. The man who had disappeared, leaving nothing but terror behind. It only moves when you look away. His mind spiraled back to the words carved into the wall. The same words that had pulled him into this nightmare. Was it true? Was it real? The whispers, in the air, the footsteps, the eyes. Could it really be waiting for him to make a mistake? To turn away, even for a fraction of a second. The sound of movement outside, closer now, was unmistakable. Something was pushing its way through the underbrush, dragging its feet through the dead leaves. And then, a voice, a low, guttural growl, a sound that came from deep within the earth, as though the forest itself was speaking, growling, hissing its hunger. Luke's skin crawled, every fiber of his being screamed for him to look away, to make a break for it, to escape the blind and never look back. But he couldn't. He couldn't take his eyes off the window. The eyes were there, still watching, still glowing like pale lanterns in the dark. But then, the sound of the door creaking, a slow, agonizing groan. The hinges, rusted with age, shuddered, as if something was pushing against them, forcing them open. Luke's heart pounded in his chest. His breath came in sharp gasps, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the glowing orbs in the dark. The forest was closing in, the walls of the blind shrinking with every heartbeat. The door, it was opening. He had no choice. He couldn't stay here. But as he turned, his eyes flicked downward, just for a second, just a fraction of a second. And that's when it happened. A figure moved. Too fast, too unnatural. It was inside the blind, Luke's throat constricted. He tried to scream, but the air was thick, suffocating. The thing, whatever it was, loomed in the corner, its shape a nightmare of jagged limbs and shadows. It was no longer outside the blind. It was here, and now it was closing in. Luke's eyes snapped back to the corner of the blind, where the shadows had shifted. It wasn't just the darkness now. It wasn't just a trick of the light. No, the thing that had been watching him, waiting for the slightest moment of vulnerability, was standing there, right there. The air turned frigid in an instant, a bone-chilling cold that sliced through the very marrow of his bones. The temperature dropped so fast, so abruptly, that Luke's breath clouded in the air, small wisps of white vapor escaping his lips, as though the very essence of life was being stolen from him. He felt it, a presence, something ancient, malevolent, lurking just behind the veil of reality. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Luke had to strain his neck to see it fully, its figure barely fitting within the small confines of the blind. Its limbs were long, too long, impossibly so, bent at strange, unnatural angles. The creature's arms hung loosely at its sides, joints, bending like a marionette's, and its fingers, thin and twisted, ended in sharp, cruel claws. The skin was stretched too tight over its frame, pale and smooth like a corpse, but not quite. Something worse, something more unnatural. Its features were contorted, its face a sickening amalgamation of twisted human traits, but stretched and blurred, as though its very form was incomplete, like a nightmare that had yet to find its shape. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, an erratic, painful beat that drowned out all rational thought. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry and the air tasted of rot, of mildew, of something worse than death. The thing's eyes, those pale, glowing orbs, locked onto his, and it smiled. Not a smile. It was more of a grotesque expression, as though the thing's face had learned the concept of a smile, but had forgotten how to execute it properly. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, the corners pulling back far too far, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. There was no warmth to the smile, no recognition. Just an empty, hollow expression of something cruel, something hungry. Luke tried to move, tried to scream, but his body refused to obey. The terror that gripped him was paralyzing, holding him in place like an insect caught in amber. The thing inched closer, its movements fluid and unnerving, like something that didn't belong in this world. its legs bent at unnatural angles as it slithered forward, the dirt beneath its feet crumbling away as if the earth itself were unwilling to support its presence. The floor groaned, the walls rattled, and the whole blind seemed to sway with the weight of its arrival. Then, the whispers returned, but they weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, not human screams. These were deeper, animalistic, echoing through the very core of Luke's being. They reverberated in his mind, thrumming against his skull, shaking the very foundation of his sanity. The voices, screaming, pleading, demanding, rose and fell, like the cries of the lost, the damned, the ones who had been consumed by the thing that now stood before him. The creature paused, its head tilting to the side as though studying him, its unnerving eyes narrowing. It sniffed the air, the movement jerky and grotesque, its long, thin nose flaring as it inhaled deeply. Luke could feel his skin crawl, the air around him vibrating with a low, almost inaudible hum. Something was about to happen, and then, with a sharp, dry sound, it spoke. Its voice was not what he expected. It was not deep or booming, like the voice of something from the abyss. No, its voice was soft, almost a whisper, but so cold that it felt like ice cutting through his flesh. The words it spoke seemed to echo around him, like they were being whispered into his very soul. "You should not have come here." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His knees wobbled beneath him, but he managed to keep his footing. Should not have come here? How did it know that? How did it know that he was an intruder, that he was not meant to be in the blind, not meant to witness this horror? The creature took another step forward, its claws scraping against the floor, with an unnerving screech. The very air seemed to recoil from it, thickening around him, closing in like a noose. Luke's mind raced, and in the depths of his terror, a single thought bloomed: the photo. The photo of the terrified man sitting in the blind. The man who had been here before. He had left, hadn't he? The creature. It had taken him. It had consumed him. Luke's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't let it happen to him. He couldn't be next. His legs, finally breaking free from the paralysis, began to move. Slowly, shakily, his body responding to the primal instinct to survive. He could feel it. The thing was closing in on him, but he had to try. He had to get out. His hand gripped the door, and with a strength he didn't know he had left, he wrenched it open. The heavy wooden door groaned in protest, but it gave way, and then a scream. Not from him, but from something else. The scream cut through the air, like a razor, high-pitched and full of agony. It wasn't the thing that screamed, though. No, it was something else, something in the forest, in the trees. The sound echoed through the blind, vibrating through Luke's very bones. The earth trembled beneath him, and the shadows around him seemed to pulse with life, as though the forest itself was alive, reacting to whatever was happening. The creature paused, its gaze snapping back to the door, its glowing eyes narrowing. For a moment the air seemed to freeze, time grinding to a halt as it locked its gaze on Luke. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanished. But the door was still open, and the forest outside was darker than before, twisted and distorted. Luke hesitated. His body screamed for him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, caught in the grip of uncertainty. The scream had stopped, but it was still there, hanging in the air like a shadow, like a warning. The thing had left, but it was still there, somewhere, and whatever had screamed. It wasn't the last sound he would hear tonight. The door swung wide, the outside world bathed in the faintest moonlight. But as Luke stepped into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly the night. It wasn't the familiar forest he had walked into earlier, with the comforting rustle of leaves and the distant calls of wildlife. No, this was a place that had changed, a place twisted, distorted by the creature's presence. The trees loomed overhead, their limbs writhing like skeletal arms, casting shadows that moved even when the wind was still. The air had thickened, the sharp tang of decay mixing with the earthy smell of damp soil, making every breath feel like an intrusion. Luke took a step forward, his foot sinking slightly into the soft ground. The forest felt wrong. The whispers, those maddening, gut-wrenching voices, were still there, circling him, rising and falling like the wind, though he could no longer distinguish words. They were as much a part of the forest now as the trees themselves, and then there it was again. The sound, the dragging footsteps. It wasn't the creature. No, this was something different, slower, more deliberate. A heavy, slow shuffle that echoed in the night air, a sound that sent waves of cold creeping down his spine. Luke's breath quickened, a bead of sweat trickling down his forehead despite the chill. He felt it now. It was coming. He wasn't sure whether he was still following the path or if the forest itself had shifted, pulling him deeper, but he couldn't stop moving. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know if he was going anywhere at all. All he knew was that if he stopped, if he turned around, that thing would find him again. A scream sliced through the air, loud, sharp, full of terror. It was close. Too close. It was the same scream, the one that had echoed through the blind just moments before. The scream of someone, or something, who had been dragged into the dark. Luke's feet moved faster now, his heart pounding, as the scream seemed to chase him, the source of it just out of reach. He dared not look back. He couldn't. Not now. And then he saw it. The clearing, the hunting blind. It stood there in the moonlight, its silhouette etched against the dark sky like a grim monument to some forgotten ritual. But it wasn't the same blind. Not really. The clearing was bigger, the trees surrounding it wider, their gnarled branches twisting toward the structure, as if they were trying to pull it deeper into the earth. The thing inside the blind wasn't gone. It was waiting. It had been waiting for him to return. Luke's pulse hammered in his ears as he approached the blind, the ground beneath his boots thick and soft with moss and rotting leaves. But something was different. The blind looked older, as if it had been abandoned for much longer than he had thought. The wood was cracked, splintered, its edges worn with time and decay. But the door, it was ajar. He stepped closer, his breath ragged in his chest, the scent of decay stronger here. The whispers were louder now. In fact, they were all around him, circling like vultures, twisting through the air and surrounding him. They were not voices anymore, not just whispers. They were thoughts. Dark, chaotic thoughts that clawed at the back of his mind. He could hear them clearly now. You should have stayed away. You will be part of it, just like the others. It's hungry. It has always been hungry. He reached out and gripped the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open further. The hinges screamed in protest, their sound like the wail of some tortured soul. But Luke couldn't stop now. He couldn't turn back. Inside the blind, the air was thick, and the light was dim, the glow of the moon filtering in through cracks in the walls. But the shadows, those shadows, they were moving. Something stirred in the corner. He could see it now, crouched in the dark, a shape blending with the shadows. The thing was still there, still waiting. But there was something else, something worse, something more twisted. There, in the center of the blind, was a pile of bones. But they weren't just bones. No. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Luke realized with a sickening lurch that the bones were fused together. They were not just remnants of past victims, but pieces of something more, something alive. The bones shuddered and shifted, the flesh that clung to them twitching, as though the thing had been feeding on them for years, maybe longer. The pieces of human remains twisted and morphed together, making something grotesque. A terrifying pulsating mass that resembled a corpse reconstructed, and then it moved. Not the way a living being would move. It shifted, slithered like a serpent, its bones groaning in protest. But it was alive. It was waking up. The pile of bones, the remains of all those who had been consumed by the thing, had become part of it, part of the curse, part of the hunger that had driven it to this place. And then, in the farthest corner of the blind, Luke saw the Polaroid photo, the same photo he had found earlier. The one with the man sitting in the blind, staring into the camera with terrified eyes. But the man was no longer in the photo. Luke was. The camera had taken the shot in the moment before the thing had consumed him. The man's eyes wide and frantic, staring directly into the lens. But now Luke could see them too. He was the one in the photo. He had become part of the thing's history, part of the cycle that had trapped the souls of those who ventured too far into the forest, those who disturbed the blind. He turned toward the door in a final desperate bid for escape. But there were no footprints leading away from the blind. There was no way out. The footsteps had come full circle, leading back into the very place they had begun. And the forest. The forest was alive. It was closing in. The whispers grew louder, the voices of the lost becoming clearer, more distinct. They were all here now, and Luke finally understood. The creature, the thing in the blind, it had never needed to hunt. It had never needed to consume. It was a force, an ancient force, a reflection of something deeper, something more primal. It had always been waiting for the next intruder to arrive, to become part of its twisted history, to be fed to the hunger. Luke was part of the blind now. The door slammed shut behind him, and the forest outside fell silent, save for the distant sound of dragging footsteps in the dark. It felt like the world around Luke was closing in, every inch of it, a tightening noose. The blind, a crumbling prison, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its walls breathing in slow, measured rhythms as though it were a living creature itself. His every step, every shallow breath, only seemed to amplify the crushing weight that bore down upon him. The door had slammed shut behind him, as if the blind had sealed itself once again. But that wasn't the worst of it. No, the worst was the silence. The whispering voices, the screaming winds, the rustling leaves, all of it had faded into a horrifying stillness, leaving Luke alone in the suffocating gloom. He felt as though he was in a void, as if the forest itself had ceased to exist, and only the blind remained, its ancient decaying walls closing in on him. It was a slow, agonizing process, like being buried alive in darkness, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. Luke's eyes were drawn to the corners of the blind, where shadows seemed to twist and writhe, like the remnants of nightmares too terrible to remember. The space felt infinite, though it was only a few square feet. There was no way out. The door, if it even existed anymore, had become nothing but a phantom. There was only the blind, and the creature, and the cold, endless dark. Suddenly, the floor beneath him gave way with a creak. The wood shifted, groaning as though it had been disturbed by some unseen force. Luke froze, his heartbeat quickening, a bead of sweat trickling down his neck. He didn't dare look down. He already knew what he would find. The darkness was not the same as the world outside. Here, the shadows had weight. The blind itself was hungry, eager to claim whatever soul dared to enter. That was when the smell hit him. It wasn't the damp earth or the decay of rotting wood. It was something much worse. The smell of death. Not just death, but the death of time itself. A smell that curled into his lungs, wrapped around his ribs like a strangling hand. It was a stale, sour stench, mixed with the fetid odor of decay, like something that had long passed beyond the natural decay process. Something trapped, stuck between life and death. The source of the stench was clear. The pile of bones in the center of the blind had begun to stir again, the hollow eyes of the long-dead victims shifting as if they were remembering. The moment before their end, Luke staggered backward, the sickening realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. The bones weren't just remnants of past victims. They were still connected to the creature, still alive. They were not a pile of broken remains. They were part of it. And as the shadows in the corners of the room shifted again, Luke could see something horrific taking shape in the gloom. A face. The face was familiar but twisted, an unholy fusion of human and something else. It was his own face, but not his own. The skin stretched and pulled, contorted beyond recognition, as if something was trying to force its way into his identity, warping it, consuming it. His own face stared back at him with wide, terrified eyes, twisted into an expression of hopelessness, a reflection of his own fear and the cursed fate awaiting him. His heart raced, his breath quickened, his legs felt weak beneath him. But there was nowhere to run, no place to hide. He was trapped in the blind, trapped with the thing. "You belong to it now," the voice whispered, coming from the thing behind him, behind his very reflection. It was not the same voice he had heard before. It was softer but older, more ancient, like something speaking from the depths of the earth itself. Luke whirled around, his hands flying to his ears, but the voice wasn't just in his head anymore. It filled the entire blind, the walls, the floor, the air. Everything around him was echoing with its maddening whispers. "You will never leave. You will never be free. You have become a part of it, just as the others have. You will be remembered for all eternity." He tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. No words came. He was suffocating on the air of this cursed place, surrounded by the echoes of those who had gone before. The memories of the dead, all caught in the blind's sickening grip. And then it happened. The floor beneath him cracked open. Not a simple crack, no, this was worse. The wood splintered in all directions with a sickening crack, and the air grew cold, freezing him where he stood. He stumbled back, barely managing to keep his balance as something erupted from the ground, something alive, a mass of twisted, crawling shapes that poured out of the hole in the floor. They were faces, hundreds, maybe thousands, faces. They were contorted, some still alive, others little more than decayed remnants. But all of them had one thing in common. They were screaming. Their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent agony, their forms twisted and melted together into a monstrous tapestry of souls, all fused by the hunger of the creature. Luke stumbled back, unable to tear his eyes away from the writhing mass of faces that now filled the blind. Some were the faces of men, others of women. Some he didn't recognize, but many. Many were his own. The faces of his past, the faces of his family, of his friends. His brother's eyes, his mother's hollow gaze, they were all here, twisted and writhing in the dark. He felt a strange, sickening connection to them, a pull, an inevitability. He understood now. This wasn't just some haunted place. This wasn't just a cursed hunting blind. It was the boundary between life and death, the boundary where souls were trapped, lost forever to the creature, feeding its endless hunger. Luke's knees buckled. He fell to the ground, his hands trembling as they met the cold, lifeless dirt. He was one of them now, a soul trapped, condemned to wander this dark and endless void, a part of the creature's twisted collection of victims. He could feel it, the weight of their endless, silent screams pressing down on him, pulling him into the black. But even as he sank deeper into despair, even as he felt the last traces of his humanity slipping away, something stirred within him. A dim flicker of resistance, a memory, a longing for life, for the world he had known. But the thing, the entity, would never allow that. He felt his body being drawn closer to the center of the blind. The pile of bones, the faces, the twisted remains. It was all merging, fusing, pulling him in. The creature was ready, the blind was waiting, and Luke's final scream was lost among the chorus of the lost. The weight of the dark had swallowed Luke whole. He could feel the coldness in his bones, the suffocating absence of air, as he was pulled into the dark recesses of the blind. The walls no longer felt like walls. They were skin, a living thing that stretched and groaned with each passing moment. The air was thick with a primal stench, the bitter scent of rot and decay that seeped into the fabric of his thoughts, his memories. There was no escape. Not now. The hunger had claimed him, and with that, he was bound to the cursed realm of the blind, a place where time twisted and contorted, no longer following the rules of the living world. The forest outside no longer existed in the way he had known it. He had crossed over. He had crossed into something darker. And in that dark, a voice whispered. It wasn't the same voice that had spoken to him before. This voice was deeper, more ancient. It reverberated through his very bones as though it came from the earth itself, from a place beyond the forest, beyond this world. It was a language that could not be understood, but Luke understood it all the same. This place was older than anything he had ever known. This place had always been. Those who are taken, the voice whispered, its tones low and heavy. They are not just consumed, they become the keepers of the hunger, the blind, the keeper of souls. You are its new vessel. Luke's heart raced, his skin slick with sweat as the voice wrapped around him, a twisted embrace that he could neither escape nor resist. It was all-encompassing, drowning him in its weight. The faces of the lost ones, those souls he had seen, melded into the creature's grotesque form, seemed to stare at him with vacant eyes, their mouths still open in soundless screams. They too had been part of the cycle, trapped like insects in amber, doomed to serve the endless hunger. And now, Luke was one of them. The realization didn't come all at once. It was a creeping horror, slow and insidious, like poison seeping into his veins. First, he tried to fight it. His mind rebelled. His body trembled. He tried to scream, but the sound that came from his throat was not his own. It was the sound of every soul that had been trapped before him, every soul that had been consumed and forced to endure the endless cycle. It was a scream that had no beginning and no end. It was the scream of time itself, of the blind, of the hunger. You will remember this place, the voice said, though it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You will become its reflection. You will walk in its footsteps, for there is no escape. The blind remembers every soul that enters, and when you look away, when you try to escape, it is waiting, always waiting. Luke couldn't fight it any longer. His limbs went limp as the air around him thickened, the shadows curling around his body like a lover's touch. It was the feeling of being watched that broke him. Every inch of the blind, every creaking floorboard, every flicker of the dim light, it was all eyes. Eyes that had seen the souls that had come before him. Eyes that had seen every victim, every face, every life that had been swallowed by the blind, by the creature, by the hunger. He couldn't look away. And in that moment, he realized why. It only moves when you look away. The thought hit him like a thunderclap, as if the universe had suddenly snapped into focus. The blind was not just a place, it was a prison, a trap built from the very bones of those who had fallen into its grasp. The creature, the hunger, it didn't just consume souls, it trapped them, binding them to the blind itself. The walls of the blind were not just wood and nails, they were a reflection of the souls that had been devoured, the collective memories of those lost in this place. Luke's heart twisted in his chest. He could feel the weight of the blind pressing down on him. He was part of it now. His soul had been bound to the hunger, to the blind, to the ancient thing that had been feeding for centuries, for millennia. And then, just as his mind began to crack under the pressure of the realization, the air in the blind shifted. The shadows moved again, but this time they did not move like mere shadows. They moved like something alive. A shape took form in the corner of the blind, an indistinct figure, half submerged in darkness. It was crouched, waiting, its breath shallow but steady. The smell of decay grew stronger. The thing breathed, and then Luke saw it. The face. It was his face again, the same twisted, contorted version of himself that he had seen before. But this time, the eyes were not filled with terror. They were filled with emptiness. A hollow gaze that stretched into the dark. Eyes that had forgotten what it meant to live. It was him, Luke realized with a sickening lurch, that this wasn't a version of him from before. This was him after. This was the version of himself that had been consumed by the hunger, twisted and lost in the void of the blind. It was what he was becoming. And worse, this version of him was waiting. Waiting for someone new to cross the threshold. Waiting for the next fool who would dare enter. For the next soul that would become part of the never-ending cycle. And in that moment, he knew. He had already become the keeper. His hands reached out, not in a desperate attempt to escape, but in quiet acceptance. He felt the weight of the hunger settle deep into his chest. The walls of the blind whispered his name, repeating it over and over as the shadows closed in on him. The faces of the lost, of the dead, filled his vision, their hollow eyes staring at him. They were no longer just souls. They were the blind. The blind was them. It was a living thing, a reflection of all those it had consumed, and Luke was now a part of it. The voice echoed again, the last words he would ever hear, the last thing that would bind him to this place forever. When you look away, the blind will be waiting. And as Luke's mind faded, as the hunger consumed him, he realized there would be no end to this. The blind would never stop. It would never let go, and soon it would be waiting for someone else. The darkness surrounding Luke was suffocating, a tight, oppressive force that wrapped around his soul, pressing in from all sides. The hunger, the blind, it was all one now. He could feel it, the pulse of the place. It was alive, vibrating beneath his skin like an ancient heartbeat, thudding through the walls, the floor, the bones beneath him. Every breath he took was a breath drawn from the blind, every thought a reflection of its insatiable hunger. Luke's hands, once trembling, had gone still. He no longer felt the need to move. He no longer felt the need to fight. What was there to fight for? The world outside had ceased to matter. There was only the blind. There was only the hunger. But beneath the oppressive darkness, something flickered. A presence, faint at first, like the faintest ember glowing in the deepest of shadows. It was a feeling, not a thought, not an image, just a sensation, a reminder, something still lived inside him. He could remember the world before, the forest, the crisp mountain air, the sounds of the wind in the trees, the life he had left behind, a life filled with dreams and ambitions that had once felt so real. A flash of his brother's face, laughing around a campfire, his mother's hands, warm and soft, brushing his hair, his childhood, gone, all of it slipping through his fingers like sand. But it was all gone now, wasn't it? The hunger had claimed it all. Still, something stirred in him, something defiant. His mind was hazy, his body drained, but there was a gnawing question that refused to be silenced. Why? Why was he here? The blind's walls whispered their answer in jagged, broken fragments. They spoke not in words, but in the emotions they invoked. The hunger was a cycle, a curse that had no beginning and no end. Those who entered the blind were never meant to leave. And those who were taken, those whose souls had been devoured, became part of the cycle, trapped within the ever-hungry dark, forever bound to the creature's insidious will. Luke felt his body shift, an unnatural twisting deep in his bones. He could sense his form merging with the blind, his humanity fading into something else. Something older, something more primal. The hunger wasn't just a physical need. No, it was a hunger that existed on a deeper level, a hunger for something even more insidious. It fed on memories, on time, on lives that had once been whole, and now Luke understood. He wasn't just a victim, he wasn't just a lost soul. He was part of the hunger, a keeper, a reflection of the blind itself. And then, just as the weight of that knowledge sank into him like 1,000 needles, the walls of the blind began to shift. It wasn't the usual creaking, the usual groaning of an old structure falling apart. It was movement, subtle and unnatural. The wood warped and twisted, bending in impossible ways as though it were alive. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The light from the cracks in the walls shifted, becoming a sickly green, casting long, grotesque shapes across the room. It was as if the blind itself was stretching, yawning, awakening. There was no more hiding. The walls that had once been still now trembled, their jagged lines shuddering with the thrum of something powerful stirring, something ancient. And then there was the voice again, the voice that had haunted him since he first entered the blind. But this time it was different. It wasn't a whisper, it wasn't a murmur. It was a roar, like the echo of the earth itself tearing open. "You cannot hide," it growled. "You cannot escape." Luke felt the hunger surge within him. It was no longer an abstract concept. It wasn't something out there stalking him. It was in him, coursing through his veins, twisting his thoughts. He could feel the pull of it, the call to feed, to become, to sink deeper into the darkness and never return. A shadow appeared before him, a shape, slowly taking form from the inky blackness of the blind. It was the thing he had feared most, the thing he had fought to avoid, the thing that had been waiting, watching. It was the creature. It was him. The shape was humanoid, but twisted, its limbs too long, its body stretched and contorted. Its face was a grotesque parody of Luke's own, the eyes wide and empty, the mouth gaping open as if to consume the world itself. Its body was a mass of shadows shifting and pulsating with an inhuman hunger. The creature was him, but not. It was a reflection, a hollowed-out version of himself, a version that had been consumed long ago, stripped of everything that made him human. "Do you see now?" The creature's voice rumbled, low and guttural. "Do you understand what you are? What you've become?" Luke's heart beat faster, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He tried to look away, but the pull was too strong. The hunger was overwhelming. The creature, his reflection, stepped forward, its form growing larger and more monstrous as it closed the distance between them. "You will remember," it said. Its words now a torrent, a flood. "You will remember the lives you've taken, the ones you've forgotten, the ones you'll become." Luke's hands trembled as he reached out, feeling the pull of the creature, the pull of the blind. He wanted to scream, but the scream lodged in his throat, a sob that died before it could escape. The blind was not just a place of death. It was a place of rebirth. Those who came here were never truly gone. They were absorbed, transformed. They were folded into the hunger, into the blind itself, like grains of sand lost to the tide. Luke could feel it now. He could feel his body changing, his skin turning cold, his mind slipping away, sinking into the abyss. His thoughts began to scatter, his memories fading like fog in the morning sun. He knew what was happening. He was becoming the creature. He was becoming the keeper, just as the voice had promised. He was part of it now. But even as he felt himself slipping, even as he lost himself to the hunger, a flicker of defiance remained. A whisper, deep within his soul, told him that this cycle, this endless hunger, could be broken. It had to be. The question remained, would he ever find the strength to look away, to escape the grip of the blind, the creature, and the endless cycle? Or was he already lost? The shadows whispered. The hunger waited. Luke could no longer feel his own heartbeat. His senses were blurring, slipping through his fingers like wet sand. His body felt heavier, colder, wrong. He no longer knew where his thoughts ended and where the blind began. His vision was clouded, shrouded in the same inky blackness that had swallowed the world around him. The shadows pressed in like a weight that squeezed the life out of him. And yet, he could still feel something. The hunger, yes. He could still feel it inside him, but it had become something more, something alive. It was no longer just a physical urge. It was a gnawing, insidious presence twisting through his veins, settling deep into his bones. He could feel its ancient pulse within his chest, matching his own rhythm, as if his body had been subsumed into the darkness. The blind had consumed him completely, and yet, somehow, he still felt human. His mind, already fraying at the edges, clung to one last thought. He had to fight. He couldn't let it win. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance. The creature that had once been him, his twisted reflection, stood before him, its grotesque form swaying in the darkness like a spectre. Its face, Luke's face, was stretched into an empty grin, the eyes hollow voids that had no trace of human emotion. It was him, but worse. It was what he had become, what he was destined to be if he allowed himself to succumb fully to the blind's hunger. "You're nothing now," the creature hissed, its voice ragged as if it had been clawed out of the darkness itself. "You are one with the hunger. The blind will consume you until there is nothing left. And then it will take the next one and the next forever. And you'll be here watching forever." Luke's stomach churned at the thought. This wasn't him. This couldn't be him. A spark of defiance flared in his chest. He was still here. He was still fighting. "You don't get to take me," Luke managed to whisper, his voice hoarse but laced with an unbroken resolve. His hands gripped the wooden wall of the blind, cold splinters digging into his palm. He could feel the blood running from the cuts, but the pain felt distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. The creature tilted its head, the hollow eyes watching him with twisted fascination. "Take you? You are taken," it rasped. "There is no escaping. You are already part of the hunger. You were always meant to be." The shadows around them began to shift, pulling at Luke's feet, tugging at him like a magnetic force. He could feel it, the pull of the blind, urging him to let go, to surrender to the hunger, but something deep within him refused. He could still remember what it was like to feel human. His chest tightened and he gasped for breath, each inhale harder than the last. The hunger inside him churned, clawing at his insides, begging for release. But Luke fought back. In his mind, he could hear the whispers of the lost ones, the voices of those who had been devoured before him. They spoke to him not in words but in feelings, longing, regret, pain, hope. They whispered of a way out, a way to break the cycle, a way to end the hunger once and for all. But there was a catch. It would cost him everything. Luke's mind swirled, with images, his family, his home, the life he had known, before they dissolved into the shadows, leaving only the blind, the hunger, and the creature standing before him. The cycle would never stop. It would never break. But if he could learn to look away, if he could reject the hunger and face the truth, then maybe, just maybe, he could set himself free. His eyes locked onto the creature's face, his own face. And for the first time since entering the blind, he looked away. The air shifted. The shadows seemed to recoil, shuddering as if they had been wounded. The hunger inside him screamed, an agonizing shriek that reverberated through the walls of the blind. The creature, the twisted reflection of him, howled, reaching out with long, clawed hands, but Luke stood firm. His body trembled with the effort, but his will remained. For the first time, he felt the hunger slip. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was weakened. Luke felt a rush of clarity, a fleeting moment of freedom. The pull of the blind loosened its grip on his chest, and for the briefest of moments he could see the world outside. He could hear the wind in the trees. He could smell the crisp scent of pine. For a single, fragile moment, he remembered. But then, as quickly as it came, the moment faded. The hunger roared back to life inside him, the blind pushing against his consciousness with the force of 1,000 storms. The walls creaked and groaned, a sound that was both ancient and new, a warning that Luke had no choice but to heed. "You cannot look away," the creature snarled, its voice a venomous hiss. "The blind will consume you. It will take you. You are already lost." Luke staggered back, his feet stumbling over the cold wooden floor. The hunger surged once again, overwhelming his senses, pulling him back into the depths of the blind. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him, suffocating him. But he had seen something. He had seen the way out. The creature lunged, but Luke reacted instinctively, diving towards the center of the blind, reaching for the torn backpack he had seen earlier. The one that had been abandoned, the one that had been left behind. He pulled it open, hands trembling as he searched through the contents. The photo, the Polaroid, the note. It only moves when you look away. Luke's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the words settled in. The blind wasn't a prison in the way he had imagined. It wasn't just a place. It was alive, yes, but more than that, it was the reflection of his own fear. The hunger existed because he had looked away. He had given it power by succumbing to it, and it was only through fighting the urge to turn away, to give in to the darkness, that the hunger would lose its grip. He had to look at it. He had to face it. Luke took a deep breath, his hands shaking, and he looked. He looked at the twisted creature before him, himself, staring directly into its hollow eyes. The creature paused. It snarled, its form flickering in and out of reality, as though the act of being looked at was tearing it apart. Its eyes widened in shock, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Luke held firm, forcing himself to look, to resist. The blind shuddered. Again, this time violently. A sharp crack echoed through the room as the wooden walls splintered, splitting apart with a deafening sound. And then, for the briefest moment, Luke saw the light. Luke's mind was a storm, an unrelenting torrent of chaos, fragments of memory, and primal fear. His chest heaved with each breath, the very air in the blind thick with the smell of rot and decay. The hunger was everywhere, its tendrils wrapping around him like an ancient curse tugging at his very soul. But he had seen it. He had felt the truth, even if it made his heart twist with terror. The blind was not just a place. It was an echo. It was a reflection of what he had become, of what he feared most. He could still feel the weight of the creature before him, the twisted version of himself that had become the embodiment of the blind's insidious power. Its hollow eyes, its crooked mouth, a mirror of everything he had once been, now twisted into something monstrous. The creature snarled at him, its fingers like claws, grasping at the air in desperation. The blind, the hunger, fed off their connection, and it wanted him back. It wanted to consume him. But Luke was no longer the frightened man who had stumbled into the forest all those days ago. He had seen the way out, and he would not be tricked again. He knew the truth now. The hunger could only exist if he looked away. He had to stay focused. Luke's eyes burned with the effort of holding his gaze on the creature. It recoiled with every passing second, its form flickering like the last embers of a dying fire. He could see it now, its skin peeling away, its limbs twisting in unnatural directions, its very shape collapsing in on itself as if the mere act of being looked at was unraveling it. Its cries, guttural and desperate, filled the air, but Luke did not flinch. He knew what had to be done. It was a sacrifice. But the hunger, the blind, it was not done with him yet. The shadows in the corners of the blind seemed to shift, writhing like serpents, and a terrible pressure closed in on him. The air grew colder, each breath a painful gasp, as though the very essence of life was being drawn out of him. The ground beneath him trembled, as if the blind itself were preparing to devour him whole. Luke's heart pounded as the truth hit him, like a cold slap. The blind did not want him to break free. It did not want him to look away from the creature, because that was the key. That was the power of the hunger, the way it could manipulate, could warp reality itself. The blindness of fear had allowed it to exist for so long. Luke had to fight it, fight the reflection of himself, fight the part of him that had already been consumed. He felt the weight of his decisions settle on his shoulders like a mountain. The blind would not let him go. It would destroy everything, the forest, the creatures, his own life, if it meant keeping him here forever. The darkness was already closing in on him, swallowing him up. But he refused to look away. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. His vision blurred, the hunger trying to tear his focus from the creature, to break him. He could feel the weight of his past pressing against him, all his regrets and fears clawing at him from the depths. He could feel the shadow of the brother he had lost, the face of his mother that had been stolen by time. They whispered, urging him to surrender, to let it all go. But no more. Luke did not move. The creature before him began to dissolve, its form unraveling into black smoke and shadows that circled and swirled around the room like a storm. The hunger screamed in his mind, filling his thoughts with visions of death, of his inevitable doom, of everything he had once cared about being ripped away. But through it all, Luke stood firm. And then, with a sudden crash, the walls of the blind splintered, cracked like glass breaking under immense pressure. The entire structure groaned as if it were being torn apart by forces beyond comprehension. The creature's voice wailed, a horrible, shrill sound that reverberated through the walls, shaking the very ground beneath his feet. The blind was dying. Luke took one last step forward, his heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat, but his resolve unshaken. His hands gripped the splintered wood of the wall as the shadows closed in on him. He could feel them, grasping at him, clawing at his body, at his soul. But this time, he would not be consumed. Not by the hunger, not by the creature. With a roar of defiance, Luke stepped forward, his eyes still fixed on the collapsing form of the creature. And as he did, the world seemed to bend. The air grew heavier, suffocating, as though the very fabric of reality itself was being torn, open. The walls twisted and buckled, the shadows flickering like flames, as if the blind itself were being unmade, and then silence. The hunger was gone. The air was still. The blind had crumbled to nothing. its twisted form reduced to a pile of blackened debris. The shadows that had once gripped him so tightly faded away, leaving only the empty forest surrounding him. Luke stood alone, his breath ragged, his body trembling, but alive. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that fills the world after a storm has passed, when the earth is left in a still, almost sacred calm. But then, just as suddenly, the sky above the forest darkened. A chill wind blew through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine, of earth, of something ancient. And in the distance, Luke thought he saw something moving. It was a figure, a shadow among the trees. He stared, frozen, as the figure took a step forward, then another, and then stopped. It was too far to make out clearly, but Luke's heart raced. The figure was tall, its silhouette looming, a twisted shape that seemed familiar in an unsettling way. His breath caught in his throat. It was not a person. It was the creature, and it was looking straight at him. Luke's eyes widened in terror as the figure took another step forward, and for a moment he could hear the soft, breathless whisper of the blind in his ear. A whisper that told him what he had feared all along: it never ends. The cycle was not over. It could never be. As the figure stepped forward, its face became clearer, but it wasn't his own. It was the same, yet different. The same twisted reflection, but now it had a new face to wear. Luke's face. The hunger had come for him, and it would never let him go. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as Alex and Ben set foot into the deep, shadowed heart of Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest. The forest greeted them with an eerie quietness, its towering trees casting long, angular shadows across the narrow trail. There was a subtle unease in the air, like the forest itself was watching them, a silent observer of their journey. The birds, usually so vocal at the beginning of a hike, were strangely absent. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of a leaf caught by the wind. Ben looked over at his older brother, Alex. He could see the familiar excitement in Alex's stride, the way his backpack swayed, with each step as if he'd been here 1,000 times before. Alex had always been the adventurous one, bold, confident, and never afraid to venture a little deeper into the unknown. Ben, on the other hand, had always been a bit more cautious. He liked the idea of adventure, but could never shake the feeling that something might be lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. "Do you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice breaking the silence between them. He stopped for a moment, his hand instinctively reaching for his water bottle as he scanned the trees. "Hear what?" Alex replied, not pausing in his stride. His tone was light, playful, like he hadn't noticed a thing. He gave Ben a sideways glance, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "Come on, stop being such a baby. It's just the woods." Ben shook his head, still unsure. There was something strange about the way the forest felt. The air was thick, oppressive, like something was hovering just beneath the surface, something that shouldn't be there. He brushed it off, though, telling himself it was just the unfamiliarity of the wilderness. He was a city guy after all. But Alex had always loved the wild, and Ben trusted him. So he took a deep breath, pushed the feeling down, and hurried to catch up with his older brother. By midday, they had covered a good distance, their legs aching from the uneven, rocky terrain. The sun was high in the sky now, filtering through the canopy of leaves and casting dappled shadows on the trail. They stopped to take a break beside a stream, the cool water trickling over the smooth rocks. Alex sat down immediately, his pack hitting the ground with a thud, while Ben lingered by the water. his eyes drawn to the thick brush that lined the edges of the path. "That's weird," Ben muttered under his breath as he noticed a patch of the undergrowth move despite the stillness of the air. He froze, eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of it. Nothing else in the woods seemed to stir, not a leaf, not a branch. "What's up?" Alex asked, glancing up from the snacks he was unwrapping. His voice held a playful edge, like he was mocking Ben's overactive imagination. "I thought I saw something," Ben said, his voice low, almost ashamed of himself. It was a ridiculous thought, but the feeling of being watched had only grown. Stronger as they ventured deeper into the forest. Alex rolled his eyes. "Dude, you're really starting to sound like one of those paranoid hikers. It's just a raccoon or something. Let's move." They continued on, the trail winding up a steep incline. But now, Ben felt the weight of something unseen pressing against him, a tension in the air that made his skin crawl. The path was narrow, the trees so dense above them that the sunlight seemed to evaporate the moment it touched the ground. Ben's breath grew quicker, and he picked up the pace to match Alex, who had already started to pull ahead. He tried to shake off the feeling. He didn't want to be the one to ruin the trip, but every now and then he noticed Alex glancing over his shoulder, checking to see if Ben was still behind him. The trail was becoming steeper, the incline forcing Ben to work harder to keep up. His legs burned, and he felt the familiar weight of exhaustion creeping in. But what unsettled him even more was how much further Alex seemed to be striding ahead. It was as if the older brother was walking at a different pace, faster, more determined. Ben felt a knot form in his stomach. Why was Alex so far ahead? The further they went, the more the gap between them grew. Ben's mind raced. The feeling of being alone, even when his brother was nearby, began to gnaw at him. He had to work harder. Now to keep his footing, his legs growing weaker with every step, he called out to Alex, "Hey, wait up!" But there was no response. The sound of his voice seemed to vanish in the dense forest, swallowed whole by the thick undergrowth. He pushed on, desperation starting to bubble up inside him. The forest seemed to narrow around him, the trees closing in as if trying to trap him. Finally, Ben turned a corner, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and spotted Alex, standing motionless ahead, facing away from him. At first, Ben thought it was just a trick of the light, that his brother had paused to catch his breath. But as he got closer, he noticed something was wrong. Something was off. Alex stood perfectly still, his body stiff, as though he were frozen in place. His arms were hanging limp at his sides, and his head was slightly bowed. Ben's heart rate quickened, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Alex?" Ben called again, but the older brother didn't respond. Not even a flicker of movement. The breeze rustled the leaves around him, but Alex was a statue. Ben's voice trembled as he took another step forward. "Alex, are you okay?" A chill shot through him, and as he stepped even closer, his footfall breaking the silence, Alex's body seemed to tense, though he didn't turn around. "He's fine, it's nothing," Ben tried to tell himself, but the knot in his stomach tightened. There was something deeply wrong about this, an oppressive presence that pressed in from all sides. Ben reached out, hesitating just before touching Alex's shoulder. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was fear, or maybe the feeling that his brother wasn't quite right. This was too weird. As his hand hovered, his eyes darted to the trees behind Alex. Something moved there just out of the corner of his eye. A shadow, too solid, too quick to be a trick of the light. His pulse spiked. Ben stepped back, staring at his brother's back, his breath shallow and erratic. And then, a noise, a rustle from the direction of the shadow, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, growing louder with each passing second. Ben's heart stopped. Someone was coming. But where was Alex? The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was eerily still. Ben glanced at Alex, his older brother still standing motionless, facing away from him. Then, another set of footsteps. Ben turned sharply, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. His breath hitched in his throat as he saw someone walking toward him through the trees. A figure in a dark jacket, their face hidden in the shadows. "Alex?" Ben's voice trembled, but the figure didn't answer. With every step that the figure took, a sense of dread crawled up Ben's spine. It was as though the world itself held its breath. The figure approached slowly, moving with an eerie, deliberate grace. Ben's chest tightened with panic, every instinct telling him to run, to escape whatever strange presence was drawing nearer. His legs were frozen, as though the very ground had anchored him in place, and no matter how hard he willed his body to move, his feet felt like they were stuck in the cold, wet earth. "Alex?" He croaked again, though this time it was more of a desperate whisper than a question. His voice sounded distant, hollow, as if the air around him had thickened and was muffling everything. The figure's outline grew clearer with each passing second. It was a man, or at least the shape of one, though the details remained murky, as if the shadows themselves were clinging to him, blurring his edges. The figure was tall, dressed in dark, weathered clothing that seemed to merge with the surroundings. His face was hidden in shadow, too far for Ben to make out anything more than the faintest of features. He walked slowly, deliberately, his gaze locked on something ahead that Ben couldn't see, his steps making no sound on the soft forest floor. Ben's breath caught in his throat. Why wasn't Alex moving? His brother still stood motionless in front of him, like a mannequin frozen in place, a silent sentinel in the growing tension of the moment. This isn't real. The thought hit Ben like a shock, but it did nothing to ease his heart, which was pounding erratically in his chest. His body trembled as if caught in a nightmare, the kind where you could never quite move, never quite scream loud enough to escape. The figure stepped closer. Ben's mind screamed at him to move, to do something, anything, but it was like his. Limbs were encased in ice. His eyes darted from the figure to Alex, hoping for some sign, any sign that things weren't as they seemed. The figure paused. Ben's throat went dry as he watched the figure stop just a few feet away. The air between them felt electric, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The figure's head tilted slightly, as though sensing Ben's presence for the first time, though it had been approaching him this whole time. The silence was absolute. "Alex?" Ben repeated, though the word now felt strange on his tongue, foreign. Why was he still saying that? It was as if his own voice had lost its meaning. The figure stood unmoving for another long moment. The sound of distant rustling seemed to come from the trees around them, adding to the oppressive feeling of being watched from all angles. The forest, once so calm, now felt like a vast, empty space filled with 1,000 unseen eyes. Ben's heartbeat echoed in his ears, a frantic drum that kept pace with the mounting dread in his chest. Then, without warning, the figure turned abruptly, vanishing back into the trees with a speed that made Ben's breath catch in his throat. The rustling behind him intensified as though the forest itself was alive, shifting, breathing with unnatural purpose. "Wait." Ben spun back toward Alex, but his brother wasn't standing still anymore. Alex had taken a step forward, his eyes wide. His face contorted in confusion as he looked at Ben. "Ben?" he asked, his voice raw and disoriented. His lips trembled as if he were trying to shake off some deep, personal discomfort. "What's wrong? Who are you talking to?" Ben stared at him, the world around him crashing back into focus. His pulse thudded painfully in his ears as he looked at Alex, who seemed to have no idea what had just happened. "You didn't see that?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. He could barely form the words, his mind still reeling from the encounter. Alex furrowed his brow, stepping closer. See? What? There's no one here, Ben. He glanced around, his eyes skimming the dense forest surrounding them. The eerie silence of the woods seemed to press in on them, but Alex didn't seem to notice. You're acting weird. Maybe you're just tired or something. Ben opened his mouth, trying to explain. His mind screamed at him to tell Alex what had just happened, to describe the figure he'd seen. But the words seemed to fail him. The image of the shadowy figure, so real, so vivid, faded into the fog of his mind like a dream, leaving behind only a hollow emptiness. It felt as though it had never existed at all, but Ben knew better. He could still feel the chill of its presence crawling down his spine. He shook his head, a wave of dizziness rushing through him. I saw something. Someone. In the trees. They were right here, Alex. Right behind you. Alex's expression softened, but there was an edge of concern in his eyes. He reached out, placing a hand on Ben's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. Ben, you're freaked out. It's just us out here. We've been hiking all day. It's normal to get a little disoriented in the woods. He paused, his gaze flicking back toward the trail, then back to Ben. Let's just take a break. We'll head to camp soon. But Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Something was watching them. Something had been watching them from the moment they set foot on this trail. The forest, once so welcoming, now felt suffocating, like a living thing pressing in from all sides. I think we should turn back, Ben said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice wavered as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Alex stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowed in confusion. Turn back. We've just started. We're already a day in. You're not serious, right? But Ben couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut, the sense that the trail was leading them somewhere they didn't belong, somewhere they shouldn't be. And there was something else, a nagging thought that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Something was wrong with Alex. He didn't look right. His movements were off, and the way he kept glancing at the trail ahead, like he was being pulled towards something Ben couldn't see. It unsettled him more than he could explain. Ben, come on. This is the point of the trip, right? Alex pressed, the tone of his voice changing, growing more insistent, more demanding. We're here to explore. Don't bail on me now. Ben hesitated. He glanced once more at the trees behind them, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt like a heavy, oppressive weight. He looked back at Alex. His brother was too far gone in his own world, too set on completing the trip no matter what. And Ben? Ben couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. He couldn't just pretend everything was fine. But then, as Ben opened his mouth to argue, he froze. There was a sound, a faint rustle, like footsteps, coming from the direction they had just passed. Ben turned sharply, his breath caught in his throat, and for a split second he thought he saw the shadow of a figure moving between the trees, flickering just beyond his line of sight. Alex, Ben said quietly, his voice trembling. As the fear crept back into his bones, I think we need to leave, now. Alex shook his head, but before he could say anything, another rustling sound echoed from deeper within the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping underfoot. Ben's heart raced. Who's there? He called, his voice barely, more than a whisper. Alex's eyes darted nervously around, but there was nothing, only the dark, silent woods, staring back at them. The forest seemed to exhale, an eerie, breathless silence settling between Ben and Alex. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, as though the trees themselves had leaned in closer, their shadows growing darker, more oppressive. Ben felt the weight of his fear crushing him, suffocating him, his every instinct screaming to flee. But there was nowhere to run. The woods had swallowed them whole, and now it felt as though they were trapped, caught in a web of their own making. "Ben." "You're freaking out," Alex said, though his voice lacked its usual reassuring calm. It was tinged with something darker, something that Ben couldn't quite place. "There's no one here. You're just imagining things." Ben stared at his brother, his heart thudding in his chest. Alex's face was drawn tight, his eyes darting nervously from the trail to the trees behind them, as if he were struggling to hold on to some semblance of control. But the longer Ben looked at him, the more it seemed like something was off. Something was wrong. "I'm not imagining it, Alex," Ben insisted, his voice trembling. "There was someone there, I swear it. I saw them, I heard them moving through the trees. It's like they're just watching us. Waiting." Alex looked at him for a long moment, his lips pressed into a thin line. "All right, fine. Let's just take a breather, okay?" He gestured toward a small clearing up ahead, a break in the dense woods, where the light filtered through the trees in weak golden shafts. "We'll stop there. You can sit down, calm down, and we'll figure this out." Ben didn't trust the idea of stopping. The longer they stayed in one place, the more the sense of unease settled around him, like the weight of something invisible pressing down on him. But he didn't want to argue anymore. Alex had always been the strong one, the one who made everything feel normal, even in the midst of his own growing panic. Maybe it was just his own exhaustion messing with his head, making him see things that weren't there. Still, something deep within him tugged at his conscience, a voice whispering that they shouldn't be here, that they shouldn't stay. Reluctantly, Ben nodded. "All right, let's rest." They reached the clearing, and Ben collapsed onto a moss-covered rock, his backpack slung carelessly beside him. The air was thick with the scent of earth and pine, the occasional whisper of wind stirring the branches overhead. The sunlight was faint, dappled in uneven patches on the ground, but it was enough to make the shadows around them feel more pronounced, more alive. Alex sank down beside him, his gaze lost in the distance, his posture tense. Ben studied his brother, carefully, his unease growing with every passing second. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. "Are you sure you're all right?" Ben asked after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something deep and insidious. Alex hadn't responded the way he usually did when Ben was nervous. He hadn't laughed, hadn't reassured him with that familiar smile. Instead, there was just silence and an odd tension that hung between them like a thread waiting to snap. Alex didn't answer immediately. He stared into the trees, his face pale, his jaw clenched. His eyes flicked back to Ben, but there was something off in his gaze. It was like he wasn't fully present, like his mind had drifted somewhere else. "Yeah," Alex finally replied, but the word was empty, hollow. "I'm fine." Ben swallowed, his throat dry. The knot in his stomach was twisting tighter, and every moment that passed made the forest feel more alien, more threatening. The occasional rustling of leaves or the distant cry of an animal seemed amplified in the quiet, like the very forest was alive, breathing in sync with their fear. Then, just as Ben opened his mouth to speak, a sound broke the silence, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but growing louder, clearer, until it sounded unmistakably like footsteps. Footsteps coming from the trail they had just passed, but no one was behind them. Ben's breath hitched, his pulse spiking. His eyes darted around the clearing, scanning the trees for movement, for any sign of something, someone lurking just out of sight. "Alex." Ben's voice trembled, barely audible. He didn't want to sound insane, didn't want to admit what he was feeling, but the terror was building inside him. "Someone's following us." Alex slowly turned his head, his expression unreadable, his lips barely moving as he spoke. "I told you, Ben. It's just your mind playing tricks." There's no one out there. You're hearing things. But the footsteps grew louder still, closer. Ben could feel the ground beneath him vibrating ever so slightly with each step, as though the earth itself was trembling. Ben stood abruptly, his legs stiff from sitting too long. He spun around, eyes wide, searching the trees for the source of the sound. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching longer, darker. The footsteps were getting closer, too close. "Alex, listen." Ben started, but his voice cut off as the sound of snapping twigs filled the air. The footsteps were almost upon them now. Alex stood up abruptly, his face pale, his eyes wide in confusion. "What the hell? I don't hear anything." Before he could finish, there was a sound, sharp and unmistakable, as if something or someone was pushing through the underbrush. Then, the shadow. A figure darted past the trees, so quick, so sudden, that it was gone before Ben could make sense of it. But it was there. He saw it. Just for a moment, a figure, tall, cloaked in darkness, moving faster than anything human should. Ben's heart stopped. His body tensed, the blood draining from his face as a cold sweat broke out on his skin. He had seen it. He wasn't imagining it. The shadow had been real. "Alex," Ben whispered again, his voice trembling. "Did you see that? Please tell me you saw that." Alex turned slowly, his eyes wide, his face pale. But as soon as he looked toward the spot where Ben had seen the shadow, his face twisted into something unreadable, a flicker of confusion, followed by something darker, something more distant. "I didn't see anything," Alex said quietly, his voice flat. You're losing it, Ben. There's no one here." Ben stared at him, his mind reeling. Alex's words didn't make sense. He wasn't acting like his usual self. He was distant, as though something had been taken from him, like the connection they'd always shared had fractured. Ben took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't explain it. Couldn't understand why Alex wasn't reacting the way he should. Why wasn't he scared? Before Ben could say anything else, a chilling sound cut through the air, one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up straight. It wasn't the sound of footsteps this time. No, it was something much worse. A whisper, low and guttural, it seemed to come from all around them. A voice, "Leave." The word was barely audible, but it was clear enough. And it came from everywhere. Ben froze, his body stiff with terror. He glanced frantically at Alex, who hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched at the word. The shadow of doubt, no, fear, was creeping deeper into Ben's soul. A chill ran down his spine. The whisper echoed again. "Leave." Alex didn't even acknowledge it. Ben opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, Alex walked past him, his steps slow and deliberate, heading straight toward the trail. "Where are you going?" Ben called after him, but Alex didn't respond. Didn't even glance back. Something wasn't right, and Ben felt it in every fiber of his being. The air felt wrong, heavy. Ben stood there in the clearing, frozen to the spot, watching as his brother, Alex, walked further away from him, moving with a strange, almost mechanical precision, as though he weren't the same person who had hiked beside him only hours ago. His steps were deliberate, each one heavier than the last, as though he was being pulled forward by something that wasn't entirely him. Ben's heart beat faster in his chest, the pulse thudding painfully in his ears. His hands were shaking. "Alex, where are you going?" The words came out before he could stop them, his voice raw, strained. But Alex didn't respond. The figure ahead of him, his own brother, flesh and blood, continued walking into the trees, his back straight, his gait unwavering. Ben's eyes flicked back to the woods, then to the trail behind him. The trees seemed to sway with an unnatural rhythm, like they were alive, watching, waiting. Something deep inside him screamed for him to run, to follow his brother and drag him back from whatever dark influence had gripped him. But the forest, The forest was different. It wasn't like before. Before, it had been a place of peace, quiet, the occasional rustling of leaves underfoot. Now the wind itself seemed to carry a warning, cold, bitter and sharp. The shadows had taken on a life of their own, stretching longer, deeper. It was as though the trees themselves had started to lean in, their gnarled branches curling like skeletal fingers around the clearing. Ben's breath quickened. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his body trembling with a primal fear he couldn't name. As he moved closer to the trail, he saw that Alex had stopped again, but this time it was different. Alex wasn't just standing still. No, he was staring, his face blank, his eyes empty, wide, as though seeing something only he could understand, something far beyond what Ben could grasp. "Alex," Ben called again, but the sound seemed muffled, swallowed by the thickening woods. The air felt thicker now, colder, like it was hard to breathe. Alex didn't respond. Ben's mind raced. He knew that whatever was happening wasn't right, but it was as if his brother was caught in a trance, unreachable, somewhere between reality and whatever strange world was pulling him forward. Ben felt a shiver run down his spine, his skin crawling as he approached, but every step he took felt as though it took more out of him. It was harder to move. The woods seemed to push back against him, the dense underbrush catching at his feet, the trees groaning above him, their branches swaying with a quiet, mournful hum. Ben's heart pounded as he reached out, his hand trembling as he touched Alex's shoulder. "Alex," he said, shaking him harder now, fear rising in his chest. "What's wrong with you? Snap out of it." But there was no response. His brother was cold to the touch, his skin unnaturally pale, his body stiff, like he was made of stone. Ben's stomach churned. Something was terribly wrong, and then it hit him. A realization so sharp it left him breathless. Alex had changed. It wasn't just his behavior, it was something more subtle, something that gnawed at the edges of Ben's consciousness. The way Alex stood, the way his head tilted ever so slightly toward the deep woods beyond the trail, his gaze fixed somewhere far off in the distance, unfocused. "Alex," Ben whispered, his voice shaking with dread. "Please, look at me." Still nothing. Ben's mind raced, his thoughts frantic. This wasn't Alex anymore. It couldn't be. Something had taken hold of him, something that had been watching them, following them, for who knew how long. Maybe since the moment they'd set foot in these woods. Suddenly a sound, a whisper almost too quiet to hear, came from the trees ahead of them. It was soft at first, like the wind brushing against leaves, but it grew louder, clearer. A voice, low and guttural, carried through the air. "Leave. Now, before it's too late." The voice sent a wave of icy terror through Ben's veins. His breath hitched as he spun around, scanning the trees for the source of the whisper, but there was nothing. Just the dark, silent woods, stretching out before them like a maze, endless and impenetrable. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice nearly a whisper. He turned to Alex, expecting some kind of reaction, but Alex's expression remained the same, blank, empty. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees, shaking the branches violently. Ben stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the wet ground, his heart hammering in his chest. A flicker of movement caught his eye. It was so quick, so fleeting, but Ben saw it, there just beyond the line of trees. A figure, tall, dark, a shadow among shadows, slipping through the underbrush, moving with a speed that no human could match. Ben's pulse spiked. His blood ran cold. "Alex!" he shouted, grabbing his brother by the arm and pulling him around to face him. "We need to go. We need to leave, now." But Alex didn't move, didn't even blink. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, his expression unchanged. Ben's grip tightened, his nails digging into his brother's arm. It was like holding on to a statue, cold and unyielding. The forest around them seemed to close in, the shadows deepening with each passing second, the air growing colder still. The whisper came again, but this time it was closer. Much closer. He's already here. Ben's blood ran ice cold. His legs turned to jelly, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Whatever it was, whatever had taken Alex, it was getting closer. Ben's entire body screamed to run, to flee from the forest before whatever was watching them could close in. But Alex wasn't moving. Ben's thoughts churned in panic. There was something he had to do, something he could fix. But his mind couldn't focus, couldn't settle on any one plan. The terror was so sharp, so all-consuming, that it was blurring everything. The shadows stretched long and black, pulling him deeper into the woods. The wind howled, but there was no warmth, no safety. Just an endless, oppressive darkness closing in. Then, just as Ben was about to turn and run, he heard a voice he hadn't heard in days, his brother's voice. Ben? Ben froze. He whipped around to face Alex, who was now standing taller, his face more composed, as though the trance was finally breaking. The eyes that had been so distant were now focused, alert, alive. But the words that followed chilled Ben to his core. Ben, what are you doing here? Why are you looking at me like that? It was Alex's voice, but it wasn't Alex. The tone was too calm, too strange. It didn't sound like the brother Ben had known all his life. Ben took a step back, his heart pounding in his throat. What? What are you talking about? It's me, Ben. You've been acting wrong. Alex's lips curled into a tight, cold smile, one that sent a wave of dread flooding through Ben's chest. Wrong? No, Ben, you're the one who's wrong. You're the one who needs to leave, before it's too late. The woods around them seemed to pulse, alive with some dark, hidden force. Ben's world tilted on its axis. His mind screamed at him to run, to get away from Alex, from whatever had taken root inside of him. But as he turned, he saw the figure, again, this time standing directly behind Alex. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The figure stood still, unmoving, and for just a second, Ben swore it smiled. Then everything went black. The darkness swallowed him whole. Ben's world collapsed into a suffocating black void. His breath caught in his throat as a cold, heavy silence pressed against his eardrums, drowning out the world around him. For a moment, it was as though everything had ceased to exist. The rustling trees, the whispers of the forest, even his own heartbeat, all faded into nothing. Then a shiver crawled down his spine. It was cold, so unbearably cold. A bone-deep chill that pierced through his clothing, through his skin, through his very soul. His breath came in short gasps as he opened his eyes, blinking rapidly against the oppressive darkness. His hands trembled as they reached out, feeling for something, anything that wasn't this. He was no longer standing in the clearing, no longer with Alex. The trees were gone. The trail was gone. Instead, he stood in an empty, cold place, a void that stretched on forever. The air was thick, suffocating, like he was breathing through a thick fog. Ben. The voice came from nowhere, slithering into his mind like a serpent. It was Alex's voice, but different, twisted, like a broken record, warped and distorted. Ben. His body tensed, his instincts screamed for him to run. But where? There was nowhere to go, no direction. Just this endless, empty blackness that felt alive in its own right. Suddenly, a flash of light, a distant glow in the distance, faint but undeniable. Ben's heart surged with relief. Maybe he wasn't completely alone. Maybe there was something or someone that could help him find his way out of this nightmare. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his pulse pounding in his ears as the light grew brighter, closer. The temperature dropped further, the air growing more oppressive, but Ben didn't care. He couldn't stand the idea of standing, still in this suffocating place. And then, out of the corner of his eye, a shadow. It moved quickly, darting across the blackness like something with purpose. It was tall, its shape indistinct, but there was something wrong about it. Something about the way it glided across the air, so unnatural, so otherworldly. Ben froze, his entire body seizing up with fear. He turned to follow the shadow, but before he could take another step, the whisper came again. "Leave him." Ben's breath caught in his throat. The voice was closer now, like a caress against his ear, cold and cruel. It was a voice he didn't recognize, a voice that was neither Alex's nor any other human voice. No, this was something else. Something far older. Before he could respond, the shadow appeared again, this time directly in front of him. It was taller than he had imagined, its form growing clearer as the blackness seemed to shrink around it. The shape was vaguely humanoid, but twisted, warped as though the very air was bending to its will. The thing's eyes were the worst part. Not eyes at all, really, but two voids of pure, infinite darkness. They stared at Ben without moving, without blinking, their emptiness swallowing everything around them. For a moment, Ben couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice, its voice, slithered again, this time louder, reverberating through the void. "You don't belong here. You never did." Ben tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, like a vice. He tried to run, but his legs refused to move. He was frozen in place, caught between this incomprehensible nightmare and a deep, gnawing fear. The shadow loomed larger, the air growing colder as it drew nearer, the emptiness filling with a suffocating pressure. And then, without warning, the figure reached out, its hand, or something like a hand, extending toward Ben. "You shouldn't have come." Ben tried to scream again, his voice breaking the silence for the first time in what felt like an eternity. But the sound was muffled, drowned out by the weight of the shadows around him. The dark hand hovered inches from his face, and Ben could feel the cold emanating from it, seeping into his bones, freezing his very soul. The figure's voice softened, almost tender, like a lullaby, as it whispered, "You should have stayed away, Ben. You should have listened. It was always meant to be this way." The grip of the shadow tightened, and Ben gasped in horror as his body began to freeze. His limbs stiffened, his muscles locking up in slow, agonizing succession. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but the rest of his body had become completely immobile, frozen in place by something far beyond his understanding. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a flicker, a glimmer of light. No, someone, a figure moving toward him through the darkness, slowly, deliberately. It was Alex. Ben's heart lurched, a wave of relief flooding through him. Alex was here. He'd found him. But as Alex drew closer, Ben saw the look in his eyes. They were empty, hollow, lifeless. Alex was standing there staring at him with the same blank, unseeing expression he'd worn when Ben had first tried to wake him from the trance. But now something was different. The emptiness in Alex's eyes was worse. It was as if he wasn't just vacant. It was like he was being controlled, like something was puppeteering him from the inside out. "Alex," Ben whispered, his voice strained, desperate. "Please, help me." But Alex didn't respond. Instead, his mouth moved, his lips forming words. But they weren't words, Ben understood. It was like the very air around them had shifted, the words coming from a different place, An ancient place. A place that shouldn't exist. Leave. It's too late for you. It's too late for both of you. Ben's throat tightened. What are you talking about? Alex, please help me. Alex didn't move. His body was still, and his eyes, those lifeless, empty eyes, remained fixed on Ben as if he couldn't see him at all. The shadow, the thing, reached out again, its hand coming ever closer, the cold so intense now that Ben could barely feel his fingers, his feet, his whole body. It was as if the shadow was pulling him inward, deeper into the cold, deeper into the void. The whisper in his ear came again, softer this time, almost coaxing. Come closer, Ben. There's nothing for you here. Nothing but us. You'll never leave. The voice was like 1,000 voices at once, all layered over one another in a cacophony of malevolent intent. The words seemed to wrap around him, suffocating him, pulling him in with an unrelenting force. Ben could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, crushing him under its power. He tried to scream, tried to fight back, but his body betrayed him. His legs were locked. His mind was unraveling piece by piece as he was drawn further into the abyss, and then a flash, a burst of blinding light. Ben gasped, his eyes flying open as the world around him exploded back into color. The forest, the trail, the woods, they were all back. The trees were as they had been before, silent, watching. But there was something different, something wrong. Alex was gone. Gone. Ben stumbled forward, his legs weak, his body trembling, but when he looked behind him, there was no sign of his brother. Just the empty trail stretching out behind him, as if Alex had never been there at all. Gone. Ben's breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse pounding in his ears. He turned frantically, his eyes searching the woods around him. But there was no one, no shadow, no Alex. The forest once again was silent, but the silence felt heavier now, as if it were holding its breath. Ben's heart raced. He staggered forward, calling out, but his voice broke in the empty air. The trees didn't answer. The wind didn't reply. Nothing. The forest stood still. The silence pressed down on Ben like a weight, thick and suffocating. It was as though the forest itself had drawn a shroud over him, cutting him off from everything he knew, everything he understood. His heart thudded against his chest, the sound of it drowning out the soft rustle of leaves, the far-off caw of a crow, the whisper of wind through the branches. Gone. The word echoed through his mind like a death knell, reverberating in his skull. Alex, his brother, was gone. He'd seen the figure, the one with the empty eyes, the one that had been stalking him through the darkness. He could still feel the cold fingers of that shadow, like they had wrapped themselves around his very soul, squeezing tighter with every passing moment. The voice had whispered in his ear, "Leave him. It's too late for you both." But where was Alex? Was he still out there, trapped somewhere in the void between this world and whatever that thing had been? Ben shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts from his mind. He couldn't just stand there. He had to find his brother. He had to do something. But every step he took felt like walking deeper into a nightmare. The trees loomed around him, tall and oppressive, their branches creaking as though they were alive, watching, waiting. The shadows seemed to stretch out farther than before, crawling toward him like tendrils of some ancient, unnameable force. He looked back at the path, hoping to find something that would give him an answer. But the trail seemed endless, no markers, no sign of where it led. It was as if the forest itself had closed in, trapping him in this maze of confusion and dread. A low, distant cry, almost like a howl, pierced the air, sending a chill down his spine. Ben turned sharply, instinctively glancing toward the source, but there was nothing there, just the emptiness. The same oppressive silence that had settled around him. Suddenly a sound broke the stillness, a footstep, soft but distinct. Ben froze, his heart hammering in his chest. It came from behind him, a footstep, then another, the sound of someone, or something, moving through the underbrush. He spun around, his breath shallow, his muscles tensed, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But the forest was still. Nothing. He waited, his mind spinning, every muscle aching with the effort to stay calm. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt, his fingers brushing the cold steel, but something deep inside him, told him it wouldn't help. Not here. Not in this place. The footsteps came again, closer this time, a crack of twigs beneath heavy feet, the unmistakable sound of someone walking in the woods. Ben's heart lurched. It's him. It's Alex. He whirled around, eyes wide, desperate, for any sign of his brother, but nothing. He was alone. The forest was as empty as it had been before. The air felt heavier now, thick with a malevolent presence that seemed to press in on him from every direction. A whisper fluttered through the trees, low and unrecognizable. It was a sound that crawled under his skin, tugging at his thoughts. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was laughing at him. Ben clenched his jaw, his fists tightening around the handle of the knife. He wasn't going to let it take him too. Not like this. Not without a fight. But just as quickly as the laughter had come, it faded. The forest stilled once more, leaving only the sound of Ben's ragged breathing and the rustling of leaves beneath his feet. He moved forward, each step more uncertain than the last, the weight of the air growing thicker with every passing moment. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him shifted. His foot caught on something, and before he could stop himself, he was falling, crashing to the earth with a heavy thud. Pain exploded through his body as he landed awkwardly on his side, his ribs aching as the breath was knocked from his lungs. He gasped, struggling to push himself back up, but when he glanced down, his eyes went wide with horror. Beneath him, the ground wasn't earth. It wasn't dirt. It was bone. White, jagged bones, broken, twisted, scattered across the forest floor like some grotesque mosaic. His stomach lurched, his eyes scanning the scene in growing terror. The bones weren't just randomly scattered. They formed patterns, shapes that made no sense, twisting and winding through the underbrush, almost intentional, like some kind of message. Ben scrambled back, the cold sweat on his brow slipping down his face, his heart hammering. He didn't understand. How could there be bones here, in the middle of the forest? Who had left them? His thoughts spiraled in panic, his breath coming in gasps as his mind struggled to make sense of the madness unfolding around him. But then, through the haze of fear and confusion, he caught sight of something that froze him to the spot. A figure, standing motionless just beyond the edge of the bone-laden clearing. It was a silhouette at first, but as Ben's eyes adjusted, he saw the details. It was Alex, or was it? Ben's breath hitched in his throat as his mind raced to process the impossible sight. His brother was standing in the clearing, still as stone, his face turned toward Ben, but it wasn't right. It couldn't be. His eyes were empty, hollow black voids where there should have been life. And the way he stood, rigid, unnatural, as if he had been placed there. A doll in some twisted, nightmarish tableau. Ben's chest tightened as he struggled to form a coherent thought. He took a cautious step forward, his breath shallow, his legs shaky beneath him. "Alex," he whispered, his voice a fragile thread in the stillness. The figure didn't move, didn't even blink. "Alex!" Ben shouted this time, the sound sharp and desperate in the heavy silence. Still nothing. His brother, if it was even Alex, remained completely still, his eyes fixed on some far-off point in the distance. It was as though he was waiting for something, waiting for Ben to understand. But understand what? Ben stepped closer, his pulse pounding in his ears. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling as he came within inches of the figure, when, without warning, Alex's head snapped toward him, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The air around them seemed to freeze, every sound in the forest coming to a sudden halt. The trees, the wind, even the rustling of the bones beneath his feet. They all vanished in an instant. All that remained was the bone-chilling sound of Alex's empty eyes, staring straight through him. "Leave," the voice came. But this time, it wasn't Alex's voice. It was something else. Something deep, guttural, layered with pain. Ben staggered back, his heart in his throat, as the shadow behind Alex stirred, swirling like smoke. Something was wrong, so wrong. The bones began to shift. Slowly, impossibly, they creaked and groaned, rising up from the ground, forming the shape of something alive, something monstrous. The thing towered over Ben, the twisted mass of bones, and darkness coalescing into a shape that defied logic. And then, with a voice like thunder, it spoke, "You shouldn't have come. Now you're ours." Ben felt his stomach lurch as the ground beneath him began to crack open, the earth splitting apart, pulling him toward the gaping darkness below. His screams were swallowed by the void, the forest, and everything in between. And then, everything went black. Ben's mind struggled to grasp what was happening. The world around him, this forest, this nightmare, seemed to dissolve like sand through his fingers. He couldn't make sense of it. The ground beneath him had opened, swallowing him whole, and yet he wasn't falling, not anymore. There was no weight to his body, no sense of gravity, just an unsettling sense of floating, as though he were caught between dimensions, neither here nor there. His limbs were frozen in place, his muscles locked as though they were encased in ice. Panic began to swell inside him, his heart pounding faster, louder, the oppressive silence only adding to his growing hysteria. He tried to move, to scream, but nothing came. His throat felt sealed shut, as if the very air around him had thickened, congealed into a substance that held him hostage. His mind screamed for him to wake up, to escape this cold, suffocating void. But it didn't matter. The world remained, as silent as the grave. Then came the voice. It whispered at first, soft, lilting, like a lullaby sung through a storm. Ben could feel it creeping into his thoughts, slithering through his mind like an insidious serpent, curling and twisting through his brain. "We are here. You will stay. You will always stay." The words didn't come from a mouth. They didn't even seem to come from any direction at all. They just were. They permeated everything, filling the empty space with something far worse than silence, something far older. Ben's breath hitched in his chest, his pulse quickening. He tried again, to move, his body trembling, every muscle screaming to escape. But nothing. The darkness surrounding him seemed to draw tighter, more intimate, as though the very void was alive, staring at him, devouring him from all sides. Then, in the distance, there was a shape, a figure. It stood just beyond the veil of darkness, barely visible at first, but slowly it grew clearer. Alex. Ben's chest tightened at the sight of him, but as the figure stepped closer, Ben's heart sank into his stomach. It wasn't Alex. Not really. It was his brother's shape, his form, but there was something off about it. The way he moved, awkward, jerky, like a puppet on invisible strings. His face, once so familiar, was twisted in unnatural proportions, his skin an ashen grey, his eyes two hollow, empty pits. His mouth stretched into a grotesque, too-wide grin, the kind of smile that belonged to something not human. Something that should never have been. Ben's throat burned with the need to scream, but still, nothing came. The figure of Alex, or whatever it was now, moved closer, its limbs unnaturally stiff, its every step a grotesque imitation of life. Ben's heart pounded as the figure halted just a few feet away, its empty eyes locking onto him. The void in them seemed to expand, pulling Ben in like a vacuum, drawing him into the abyss. And then, in the same voice that had whispered through the void, it spoke. "You've always known, haven't you, Ben?" The words felt like ice, chilling him to his core, but they weren't just words. They were a realization. A terrible truth that had been buried deep within him, clawing its way to the surface. He couldn't place it. He couldn't understand it. But deep inside, something whispered back, "Yes, you were never meant to walk this trail. You weren't meant to follow." Ben's vision blurred as the figure's form wavered, as if reality itself was bending around him. He tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed his voice before it could form. The figure of Alex extended a skeletal hand, its fingers twitching unnaturally, as though the very act of reaching was a torment. It was always meant to be this way. You knew, didn't? "You?" it repeated, its voice reverberating like an echo, now layered with a malicious undertone. "You walked ahead, Ben. And now, you'll never leave." Ben recoiled, his body fighting against the unseen force that held him in place. No, this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But as the figure's hand reached closer, his thoughts began to blur, memories rushing back to him in fragmented flashes. The trail. The way Alex had seemed distant, always walking ahead, always out of reach. The strange, unsettling feeling that had crept up on him every time he'd caught up with his brother, only to find him standing there, facing away, waiting. And then the moment on the ridge, when Ben had found him staring into the trees. The eerie stillness, and the voice that had spoken to him. The voice that hadn't belonged to Alex. It was too late. Ben's heart stopped. The shadow, the cold, the thing that had followed them, that had been following them all along. It wasn't just after him. It had always been after both of them. The shadow wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just a force of the dark. It was a reflection, a mirror of them, a reflection of every choice they made, every misstep, every time they ignored the warnings of the trail, of the forest, of the thing waiting for them just beyond the trees, the entity that had always been there, waiting for them to realize, waiting for them to accept. And now it was too late. Ben felt the pull again, stronger this time, like a tidal wave dragging him into the depths of the abyss. The figure of Alex moved closer, his body cracking with every step, the unnatural grin stretching impossibly wide. The cold seeped into his skin, into his bones, into his very being. The world twisted and snapped. Ben felt his mind unraveling, the very fabric of reality breaking apart as he was drawn deeper into the blackness. The edges of his vision blurred. The darkness rose up around him like a tidal wave, swallowing him whole, until there was nothing left. And then, silence. When Ben opened his eyes, he was no longer standing on the trail. He was back in the clearing. The trees loomed overhead, their shadows stretching long into the fading light. His legs were weak beneath him, but he could move, he could feel. But something was wrong, something was different. The clearing was silent, save for the distant call of birds overhead. But Ben knew. Deep down, he knew. He was still there, still in the forest, and the shadow had never left. Ben took one step forward, his mind foggy, confused, unsure of where to go or what to do next. His eyes scanned the darkened trees, the shadows lingering in the spaces where the light couldn't reach. And then a movement, a shape, caught his eye. Alex? No, it was him, but not him. The figure stood, facing away, just beyond the trees. Its shape was indistinct, But Ben could feel it watching him, feel its gaze in his bones, and then, just as before, the whisper echoed in the air, winding its way through his thoughts. "You'll never leave. You never did." Ben stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest, his legs giving way beneath him. His breath came in shallow gasps as the forest closed in around him, the trees pressing in tighter, darker, until there was nowhere to run. The trail was gone. Alex was gone, and the shadow. It was always waiting. Ben didn't know how long he had been standing there. His legs felt like they had grown roots into the earth, a numbness spreading up his spine as his mind desperately fought against the cold that had seeped into his very bones. The forest had shifted again, its air thicker than before, heavy with a staleness that clung to him like decay. A slow, crawling dread crept over him, seeping into the very fabric of his thoughts. The figure stood just beyond the trees, still facing away, motionless. The air was thick, the silence unbearable, and that whisper, that same voice, slithered through the stillness, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the dead of winter. "Come closer, Ben." The voice wasn't Alex's. It wasn't even human. It was something else, something that had no shape, no identity, just a presence, vast and infinite. Its tone was sweet and cruel, familiar and foreign all at once. Every word twisted in the air, slithering into his chest, tightening like a noose. Ben's heart slammed against his ribs as his feet refused to move. His body was frozen, not just by the cold, but by a deep, primal terror. His throat burned with the need to scream, to shout, to wake himself from this nightmare, but every breath he took seemed to press him further into the suffocating reality of the forest. He wanted to run. God, how he wanted to run. But his legs wouldn't obey. It felt as though something was holding him here, keeping him locked in place. Every instinct he had screamed at him to turn away, to flee, but he couldn't. The forest was alive, and it knew him. It knew his fear. "Come closer, Ben," the voice crooned again, and this time it felt like it was inside his mind. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a thought, a command, a part of him, something ancient and malevolent, buried deep within him, tugging at the strings of his consciousness. His eyes burned, unable to look away from the figure. He had seen this before, hadn't he? His breath came in sharp gasps as the memories began to surface, like drowning men reaching for the surface, only to be pulled back into the depths. He remembered the early days of the hike, when everything had felt so right, the steady rhythm of their steps, the bond between brothers as they explored the mountains, their laughter carrying through the trees, the weight of their packs, the taste of sweat and freedom on their lips. And then it changed. It started with Alex, always moving ahead, faster, further, as if he were being drawn forward by something that Ben couldn't see, but felt nonetheless. And then came the gaps between them, the moments when Ben would catch up, only to find Alex standing still, facing away, as if waiting for something or someone. "Come closer, Ben." The whisper cut through his thoughts like a blade. Ben's body trembled, the need to turn and run now overwhelming him. He could feel the darkness pressing against his back, the weight of the trees bending in toward him. He wanted to shout, to beg for his brother, but the words were stuck in his throat. The forest was suffocating him, and the figure, Alex, was still standing there, so still, so lifeless, his presence looming in the periphery of his vision. The figure's head jerked suddenly. The movement was too sharp, too quick, like a marionette's strings being yanked. Ben's stomach lurched. The air around him seemed to crackle with static, the trees groaning in protest, as if the forest itself was shifting, warping into something darker. And then Alex spoke. But it wasn't Alex. "You know why you're here, don't you, Ben?" The voice was hollow, empty, distorted, like it came from the deepest corners of his mind, the part of him that knew, the part of him that had always known, the part of him that was never meant to leave this place. You walked ahead, and now you're part of it, just like me, just like everything else here. Ben's chest tightened. What was he talking about? What did he mean? We are the trail, the voice continued, and something inside Ben snapped. He could feel it, that deep, suffocating pull that had been dragging at him since the beginning. It had been there the whole time, a force waiting, watching. He had walked ahead, and now it was too late to turn back. It had him now, just as it had always had him. Ben's mind reeled, struggling to make sense of the chaos around him, the growing sense of inevitability. He knew it was true. The shadow that had followed him, the thing that had taken Alex. No, that had always been Alex, and now it was a part of him. It was a part of this place. The voice was no longer speaking in words, but in thoughts, flooding his mind in waves. He was hearing things that didn't make sense but felt so undeniable. The forest calls, the forest consumes, the forest waits. Ben's body convulsed as the words overwhelmed him. His legs finally gave way beneath him, and he sank to the ground, his mind spiraling into a frenzy. The forest around him began to blur, the trees shifting into towering shadows, twisting and warping as though they were alive, bending toward him with malicious intent. The air thickened. The very earth beneath him seemed to tremble. He could feel the pulse of the forest in his veins, feel it claiming him. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. The figure was moving again, slowly, deliberately. Alex, or the thing that wore his face, was stepping toward him. Each footfall was deliberate, precise, but there was no sound, no crunch of leaves, no breaking of twigs. It was like the very earth beneath him had fallen silent, as if even the trees knew what was happening. It reached out for him. Ben's breath caught in his throat as the shadow, extended its hand toward him. The fingers, long and twisted, seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though reaching through time itself, a promise of something ancient and unyielding. He could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest, could feel his body being pulled toward. That outstretched hand, as though his will had been shattered, leaving him nothing but a puppet to the force controlling him. "Come closer, Ben," it whispered again, and this time there was no denying it. There was no fight left in him. There was only the pull of the void, the promise of something he couldn't understand, but needed, something that would claim him. But then the ground beneath him cracked. A rumble split the air, jagged and violent, as if the very earth was tearing itself apart. Ben's chest constricted, the force of the tremor nearly knocking the breath from his lungs. His body jerked violently as a massive crack spread through the ground, splitting the earth open like a wound, and out of the darkness, a figure began to rise, shrouded in shadow, cloaked in mystery. But it wasn't Alex. It was something else. Something older, something darker than the forest itself. A creature of bone and shadow, its form barely visible in the dim light, but its presence unmistakable. And it was moving toward Ben. The forest roared. The creature's emergence from the depths of the forest sent a tremor through Ben's entire body. His muscles locked, his pulse hammered against his ribcage, and his breath came in ragged gasps, too shallow to fill his lungs. The forest, the trees, even the air around him felt alive, buzzing with an ancient energy, an energy that bent toward the thing that was rising from the cracked earth. It moved slowly, its form so large and indistinct that Ben could barely make out its shape through the oppressive darkness. But there was no mistaking its presence, an overwhelming force that felt like a sudden drop in temperature, the chill of death itself. The ground groaned under its weight, the dirt shifting and crumbling as the thing emerged. its massive silhouette spilling out from the yawning chasm that had split the earth. Ben could hear the crackling of branches, the groaning of trees, as the creature took a step forward, dragging the very essence of the forest with it. He could feel it. It was pulling at him, reaching into his chest, into his mind, into the deepest parts of him. A single eye, if you could call it that, opened within the shadows. It was black, a void of infinite depth, sucking in all light, all sound, all life. Ben could feel his body lean toward it, as if an invisible tether bound him to the creature. A dark pull, like gravity forcing him closer. He resisted, but only for a moment. The creature's voice wasn't a sound at all. It was a feeling, a wave of cold that washed over Ben, like ice water poured directly into his veins. "You belong here." The words weren't spoken, but imprinted on his soul, undeniable. Ben's legs trembled and he wanted to scream, but the scream was trapped inside of him. It could not escape. The air was too thick, too still, as though the very atmosphere had conspired to mute him. The creature stepped closer, and Ben could feel the ground beneath him shudder in response. "You walked ahead, Ben. You should have never walked ahead." The words lingered in the space between them, as if the creature's voice had seeped into every crevice of the forest, every leaf, every shadow. Ben's heart skipped a beat. The voice seemed familiar, yet so foreign. It wasn't Alex's anymore. It wasn't even the voice that had called to him in the distance. No, this was something else, something that had always been here. The trees behind Ben groaned and cracked. A low, deep moan echoed through the forest, as if the land itself was grieving. The shadows twisted around him, pulling and tugging, as if they were reaching for him, claiming him. Ben's eyes burned with unshed tears, his mind a tangled mess of panic and disbelief. It was happening again, that horrible, suffocating sense that he had been here before, that he was walking the same steps, over and over. But this time, it wasn't just the forest that was consuming him. This time, it was the thing from the depths of the earth. Something ancient that had watched them from the moment they had entered the Green Mountain National Forest. And it was hungry. With a sudden lurch, the creature reached down. Its hand, if you could call it that, was enormous, covered in swirling shadows that seemed to drip and writhe like liquid darkness. The fingers were long, impossibly long, curling around Ben with the precision of a predator's strike. It closed in around him, pulling him toward its center. Ben's chest constricted, suffocating as the thing's grip tightened. Its icy coldness sinking into his flesh. He wanted to fight back, to scream, to tear himself free, but his body refused to cooperate. His mind screamed, but the words were smothered by the ever-encroaching darkness. His thoughts were swallowed by the thing's presence, dragging him deeper into its world, its grip tightening with every heartbeat. But then, something changed. A crackling sound filled the air, and Ben's body jerked upright. He couldn't see it, but he felt it. Something stirring behind him, something moving swiftly through the shadows. It wasn't the creature, not the one that was pulling him in. This was different. Ben's mind snapped to attention, his senses sharpening as his pulse quickened. He turned his head, his eyes searching through the murk of the trees, through the shadows. And there, standing at the edge of the forest, was a figure, Alex. Ben's heart leapt into his throat as his brother's silhouette emerged from the darkness. But something was wrong. The figure was too still, too motionless. The edges of his form shimmered like a mirage, flickering in and out of focus. His face was obscured by a dark haze, the features distorted and fractured, as if his very presence was being twisted by the forest itself. Ben opened his mouth to call out to him, but no sound came. His voice was a whisper in the wind, lost in the eternal darkness that surrounded him. The figure stepped forward, and Ben could feel it, the pressure on his chest lessening, but only just. The creature, The shadow snarled, an awful, guttural growl that sent a wave of pure terror through Ben's body. It released its grip on him for just a moment, and Ben staggered back, gasping for air. His chest felt like it was on fire, but he wasn't free yet. He knew that. The creature was still there, still waiting. Alex, if it was Alex, moved closer, his movements jerky, unnatural. He stopped just before the creature, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he was trapped in the same prison Ben was. The two figures stood face to face, one alive, one dead, or maybe both. "You shouldn't have come, Ben." The voice that emerged from Alex's lips was not his own. It was deeper, raspier, filled with something ancient and malevolent, something that knew Ben better than he knew himself. The words sliced through Ben's mind like a knife. "You were always meant to stay. We were always meant to stay." Ben's heart thundered in his chest as the creature's grip grew tighter again, pulling him toward its cold, unyielding center. His body screamed for freedom, but it was futile. He was being dragged into the dark, into the very heart of it all. He could see Alex now, or what was left of him. His face flickered, the features distorting as if made of smoke, and for a moment, Ben saw something terrifying. The figure wasn't just his brother anymore. It was something else, something that had taken on his shape, his form, his very essence, and twisted it into something far more sinister. Ben felt the pull of the creature's hand once again, stronger this time, as if it was drawing him into the shadows themselves. His vision blurred, his body too heavy to move, but the scream that rose in his chest was real. It was alive, and then everything went dark. Ben didn't know how long he had been in the dark. Time had twisted, fractured, and lost all meaning in this void. The oppressive silence hung thick in the air, a weight that pressed against him like the hand of something unseen. He felt numb, disoriented, as though he was sinking into the earth itself, buried in the roots of the very trees that surrounded him. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey, weighed down by something invisible, something cold. The chill crept into his bones like the bite of a winter wind, gnawing at him from the inside out. Every breath was a struggle, the air thick and stale, as though he were trapped in a tomb, suffocating beneath a layer of soil. Where was he? Was he still in the forest? Had it all been a dream? No. He could feel it, the presence, that overwhelming sense of something lurking just beyond his reach, something ancient, something alive. The world around him shifted, the shadows stretched and warped, coiling like tendrils, their movements slow, deliberate. He could hear them whispering, their voices like the rustling of dry leaves, murmuring secrets he couldn't understand. They were pulling him in, suffocating him with their quiet, insistent call, and then a sound, a footstep, soft, barely audible, but it was there. Ben's heart skipped a beat as his eyes snapped open. The darkness was still around him, but he could feel it, a shift in the air, a disturbance. His senses were overwhelmed, his mind swirling in confusion. But there was something new, something different. A shadow emerged from the darkness. A figure, Alex. The name echoed in Ben's mind, but the figure that emerged from the blackness wasn't quite right. It wasn't Alex, not in any way that he could understand. The shape was too tall, too elongated, as if the very dimensions of its body had been stretched and distorted. Its face was a blur of shadow, like a mask without features, an empty void that pulled at the edges of his mind, trying to drown him in its unrelenting darkness. It moved toward him with a slow, deliberate pace, its presence like a weight in the air pressing against him with a force that made his chest tighten. "You shouldn't have come," the voice crooned, and it was a voice Ben had heard before. The voice that had been in his head, in his dreams, in the very depths of the forest. But this time, it was different. It was deeper, darker, and it resonated within him in ways he couldn't explain. Ben's chest tightened, his heart racing. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but his body was frozen, unable to move. His thoughts were too slow, sluggish, and the pressure in his chest was unbearable, like his very soul was being squeezed by the crushing weight of the thing before him. You walked ahead, Ben. Now you're here. Just like him. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar, a deafening chorus that reverberated through every part of him. He could feel it vibrating in his bones, in his teeth, in his skull. It was too much, too overwhelming, and then from the edges of his vision he saw it. Alex, or what was left of him. The figure flickered in and out of focus, his features dissolving into the shadows, merging with the darkness around him. You walked ahead, Ben. Alex's voice echoed, but it was hollow, like an empty shell. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring at Ben with a cold emptiness that chilled him to the core. Alex's body, once so familiar, now seemed warped, twisted by something beyond comprehension. His skin was pale, too pale, stretched taut over his bones, as if it were a mask that no longer fit. His mouth opened, but instead of words, there was only a terrible screech, a sound that tore through Ben's ears like the scrape of nails on glass. We are part of it now. We always were. The words echoed in Ben's mind, curling like smoke around his thoughts. His head spun, his vision blurred, and he stumbled backward, trying to find purchase, to steady himself in the suffocating dark. But the creature moved, again. It didn't walk, didn't run. It shifted, sliding across the ground with a fluidity that defied nature. Ben's eyes were wide, his mind racing, but it was useless. The creature's presence was too overwhelming, too all-encompassing. "It has been waiting for you," the voice whispered, and this time, Ben felt the words wrap themselves around him like chains. They pulled him toward the creature, toward the darkness. The thing's hands reached for him, long and twisted like branches of some unholy tree, the fingers curling in the air as if to embrace him. He could feel its touch even before it made contact, a cold, suffocating feeling that made his skin crawl. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything of this world. It was something older, something beyond comprehension. He wanted to fight, wanted to break free from its grip, but his limbs were heavy, his mind fractured and distant. He was trapped in this nightmare, and no matter how hard he struggled, it felt like the world around him was pulling him deeper into its maw. And then a thought, a fleeting memory came to him. The hiker, the one who had posted online, the one who had described seeing the same figure, the same thing on the trail, in the same forest all those years ago. Had it been real? Had they both been pulled into this place? The creature's fingers brushed against his cheek, sending a shockwave of cold through his body. Ben gasped, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He couldn't escape. He couldn't escape. "You will be one of us." The words hung in the air, settling over him like a dark cloud. Ben's eyes began to close, the darkness consuming him, his vision fading. He could feel the creature pulling him in, the very fabric of the world around him unraveling, stretching, distorting, and then, just as his vision went black, he heard it. A voice, familiar. A call, soft but clear, like a beacon in the dark. "Ben, Ben, you're not alone." The words cut through the void, piercing the thick silence that had swallowed him whole. His heart lurched, the sound pulling him back, pulling him toward the light. It was Alex. It was real. Alex was still there. Still fighting. But the darkness didn't let go. The pull of the creature was too strong, too overwhelming. Ben could feel himself slipping further away, his body dragging toward the shadows, toward the infinite blackness that stretched out before him, and then everything snapped. The darkness dissolved, the weight lifted. For a moment, there was nothing. No sensation, no feeling, just emptiness. Ben awoke, but not in the way he had hoped. The sensation of weightlessness lingered in his mind, a strange aftershock of something other, something beyond his understanding. For a moment he thought he was dead, lost to the pull of the forest's ancient hunger. But as his senses returned, he realized he was lying on the forest floor, the cold, damp earth pressing against his skin. His breath came shallow, each inhale like a gasp for air, as though he had been submerged underwater and was only now rising to the surface. His body ached, bruised in ways he couldn't fully understand, but the pain, this pain, felt real. He could feel his pulse, his limbs, the warmth of his breath. He was alive. But where was Alex? Ben's head spun as he slowly pushed himself up, his hands shaking. The forest around him was still, silent. The usual hum of insects, the rustling of leaves, everything was gone. The trees stood like sentinels, tall and unmoving, their bark warped by centuries of time. The air was thick, saturated with something heavy. The same oppressive presence clung to him like a shadow, unseen but felt deep inside his chest. He looked around, his heart hammering in his chest. Where was Alex? His brother had been there, hadn't he? The voice, the whisper of familiarity, the memory of Alex calling out to him through the darkness. Had it been real, or had it been part of the twisted dream? The forest had a way of making everything blurry, of distorting reality, until Ben could no longer tell where the dream began and the truth ended. He pushed himself to his feet, and that's when he noticed it. A trail of footprints, fresh and imprinted, in the soft earth. They led deeper into the forest, each step deliberate, heavy with purpose. The prints weren't his own. They weren't the creature's either. They were Alex's. A jolt of hope surged through Ben's chest. Alex was alive. He had to be. Despite the overwhelming dread clawing at the back of his mind, despite the strange whispers still tugging at his thoughts, Ben followed the trail. Each step felt as though it took him deeper into the forest's grip, like a tightening vice on his soul. The shadows seemed to grow longer, twisting unnaturally as though they were alive, watching him. The trees loomed overhead like blackened pillars, their branches hanging low, their gnarled roots writhing beneath the earth. The further he walked, the more the air seemed to change, thickening with a presence that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Something was wrong. His thoughts were fractured, jumbled. He couldn't remember how long he had been walking, how far he had gone. Time felt like it had lost all meaning, and with each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, suffocating him. The trail of footprints led him to a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting pale, silver light onto the ground. And there, standing in the center of the clearing, was Alex. Ben's heart stopped. It was Alex, but not. The figure turned slowly to face him. The same. Familiar face, the same height, the same build, yet there was something wrong. The features were stretched, twisted, as though his brother had been pulled too far into the forest's depths. His skin was pale, unnaturally so, and his eyes, those once warm, familiar eyes, were wide and glassy, staring straight ahead, vacant. The darkness in the clearing seemed to seep into him, melding with the hollowness in his gaze. Ben. The voice came, but it wasn't Alex's voice. It was the same deep, rasping voice that had spoken in his head, in the darkness. The voice that had been both the creature and his brother. It was like a dead echo, a shadow of what had once been. You shouldn't have walked ahead. The words hit Ben like a physical blow. They had come full circle. He had walked ahead, and now this was the price he would pay. A chill crawled up his spine, colder than anything the night had brought him. Alex, the real Alex, the one he had once known, was gone. This thing, this mimic, was a hollow shell that wore his face, twisted by the darkness of the forest, by the ancient creature that haunted its every inch. Ben took a step back, his breath coming fast and shallow. He knew now. He knew that the thing in front of him wasn't his brother. It was something else, something that had always been here. The creature, the forest, the shadows. They were all one. One living, breathing entity that had been waiting for them. Waiting for Ben. Waiting for him to walk ahead. "You will never leave, Ben," the voice crooned, its words wrapping around him like chains. The creature, or whatever it was, began to move, slowly, gliding across the clearing toward him. Its form flickered like smoke, its edges constantly shifting, as though it could not remain solid for long. The earth beneath Ben's feet groaned and shuddered, the forest itself bending toward the thing. Ben's heart thundered in his chest. His thoughts were chaotic. "What do I do?" he thought. But the answer was already there, hidden deep within him. He had always known it. The thing that called him, that had drawn him into the forest, that had whispered in his ear in the dark. It wanted him. It needed him. Ben's legs moved, driven by an instinct far older than fear, and he ran. The forest stretched impossibly wide, the trees bending and shifting as though they were alive, grasping at him. But Ben didn't stop. His breath burned in his lungs as he pushed himself faster, running without thinking, without direction. And then he heard it, Alex's voice, or something that sounded like it. "Ben," the voice called, distant, fragmented. "You were always meant to stay." Ben's foot caught on a root, and he fell, crashing to the ground. Pain flared in his knees, but there was no time to stop. He couldn't stop. The thing behind him was closing in, its cold breath licking at his heels. He looked up. The clearing was gone. The forest had swallowed him whole. The moon above was now a sickly red, casting an eerie glow over the scene. The trees had bent inward, forming a circle around him, their branches interlocking like the bars of a cage. Ben's breath hitched. He was trapped. Behind him, the creature stood. Its form coalesced fully, its features coming into sharp, horrifying clarity. There were no eyes, no face, just the endless black of its being, shifting, writhing in the air. It had no shape, no form. It was just there, a presence that filled the space, and Ben knew that there would be no escape. It reached for him, and with the sudden, crushing realization that there was nowhere left to run, that there was no one to help, that the trail they had walked had led him here to this moment, he felt his body go numb. The cold, infinite darkness of the creature poured into him. Ben wasn't alone anymore. The next day, a hiker stumbled upon the clearing. The trees had returned to their original stillness, the air thick with the scent of pine. There was nothing unusual about the scene at first, until they found the footprints. 2 sets, side by side, leading off into the distance. No one ever found Ben or Alex again. Years later, a blog post appeared online from a hiker who had ventured into the Green Mountain National Forest, describing a strange figure that seemed to follow them, never speaking, always walking just ahead. The hiker swore the figure looked familiar, but it had no face.